In the name of the one who turns the soil into empires and empires back into soil, who watches the blood of the righteous seep into the earth, and raises from that very earth the cry of vengeance that no fortress can silence, who writes the fates of men not in ink, but in fire and iron and the last breath of the fallen, we begin. The sky over the Osmanli lands had not cleared, it had not brightened. If anything, the clouds had drawn closer to the earth, pressing down upon the hills and the rivers and the grave with a weight that even the strongest among them could feel in their bones, and Orhan Sahib stood at the center of that weight. He stood at the edge of a grave that had been freshly dug, the soil still loose, still dark, still wet with the sweat of the men who had opened the earth to receive what should never have been placed there so soon. Burhan Faladios. The name alone was enough to silence a battlefield. The sword arm of the Osmanli cause, the man who had ridden into sieges laughing, who had pulled arrows from his own flesh, and used them to mark the positions of enemies on a campaign map, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Orhan Sahib through every winter, every ambush, every betrayal that the Byzantine court had sent crawling across the frontier. And now that man lay wrapped in white cloth, still, quiet, his enormous hands folded across his chest as though he were merely resting, as though he might rise at any moment and demand to know why the march had stopped. But he would not rise. And Orhan Sahib knew this. He knew it in the way that a man knows the sun has set even before he opens his eyes. He knew it in the hollowness that had settled behind his ribs, in the strange silence that had replaced the constant hum of Burhan's presence at his side. He stood at the edge of the grave, and his men stood behind him, and no one spoke. Jakutai Sahib was there, his weathered face crumbling like old stone, tears cutting lines through the dust on his cheeks. He did not wipe them. He let them fall into the earth, as though even his grief were an offering to the soil that would now hold his brother in arms. Turhan stood 3 paces behind Orhan Sahib, his hand on the hilt of his sword, not because there was danger, but because he did not know what else to hold on to. His jaw was set so tightly that the muscles along his neck had turned to ridges of iron, and his eyes moved constantly, scanning the tree line, the ridge, the road, because grief made him vigilant. Grief made him certain that the world would strike again while they were bent low with sorrow. Orhan Sahib lowered himself. He knelt beside the body of his fallen commander, and his hands that had gripped siege ropes and broken chains and signed declarations of war, those hands trembled as he placed them upon the white cloth. He spoke then, and his voice carried across the gathered men like the low rumble of thunder that precedes a storm that will not pass quickly. You killed him, he said, and the words were not directed at any man present. They were directed at the distance, at the walls of monasteries and the gates of Byzantine strongholds and the throne rooms where conspiracies were born. You killed an Osmanli Ghazi of the highest order. You struck him down not on the battlefield where a warrior deserves to fall, but through treachery, through shadow, through the cowardice that runs through your bloodline like poison through a river. And now hear me. Hear me as the earth hears the rain and the mountains hear the wind. Your blood will flow here like rivers, not streams, not trickles, rivers. The men behind him did not cheer. They did not raise their fists or clash their swords against their shields. They simply breathed, and in that collective breath was a promise more binding than any oath sworn on any holy book. It was the promise of men who had lost one of their own, and who understood, with the clarity that only loss provides, that the world had now divided itself into 2 clear halves. There was the half that held the memory of Burhan Faladios, and there was the half that would pay for his deaths. The body was lowered, the soil was returned. The prayers were offered, long and sorrowful and ancient, the words rising into the grey sky like smoke from a fire that refused to die. And when it was finished, when the last handful of earth had been pressed into place, Orhan Sahib stood and turned to face his men, and his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man in mourning. They were the eyes of a sultan who had made a decision that could not be reversed, would not be softened, and would echo through the histories of every nation that bordered his own. We move, he said, we move now. But the movement was not the simple advance of an army along a road. It was something more intricate, more layered, something that required Orhan Sahib to hold in his mind the positions of enemies he could not see and the intentions of allies he could not entirely trust. Because the world around the Osmanli Sultanate was not still. It was churning. Shahanshah Andronikos had not been idle. He had been building. He had been whispering. He had been sending envoys to every corner of his fractured empire, pulling together the fraying threads of Byzantine authority with the desperation of a man who knows that the tapestry is rotting but cannot bear to let it fall. And Shahanshah understood something that many rulers before him had failed to grasp. He understood that Orhan Sahib was not merely a military commander. He was an idea. He was the living embodiment of a vision that stretched beyond borders and beyond generations, a vision of a world united under the banner of justice and faith, and that vision could not be defeated by swords alone. It had to be corrupted from within. And so Shahanshah had planted his seeds. Yakid was one of those seeds. The name tasted like ash in the mouths of those who spoke it. Yakid, who had once ridden beneath the Osmanli banner. Yakid, who had shared bread with the very men he would later betray. Yakid, whose defection had torn a wound in the fabric of trust that held the Osmanli forces together, a wound that bled not blood but suspicion, and suspicion was a poison far more dangerous than any blade. But we will speak more of Yakid. His story is not finished, his debt is not paid. First, there was the matter of Asporka. The princess, the Byzantine daughter who had been given in marriage to Orhan Sahib as part of an arrangement that was meant to secure peace, but had instead become the fulcrum upon which an entirely different kind of war now balanced. Asporka had left. She had ridden from the palace, from the halls that she was still learning to call home, from the chambers where she had begun to understand what it meant to be the wife of a sultan who did not rule from cushions and comfort, but from the saddle and the war tent. She had gone, and the word that reached Orhan Sahib was that she had returned to her own people, to the monastery where her father's influence still lingered like incense in a closed room. Fatima brought the news. Fatima, who moved through the world like a blade through silk, who had spent the entire night tracing routes and questioning sources and piecing together the scattered fragments of information that others would have dismissed as rumor. She stood before Orhan Sahib, her posture rigid with the urgency of what she carried, and she said, "We have searched through the night. Every trail, every contact. She is in the monastery." Orhan Sahib did not react with surprise. He did not react with anger. He reacted with stillness, and those who knew him understood that his stillness was far more dangerous than another man's rage. He looked at Fatima, and then he looked at Turhan, and then he looked at the sky, which had begun to darken as evening crept in from the east like an advancing army, and he said, "Prepare a small force. We ride to the monastery. I will bring her back myself." Nilafar heard this. Nilafar, his first wife, the woman who had stood beside him through the earliest and most brutal campaigns, who had borne him sons and endured the endless absence of a husband who belonged more to history than to any single home. Nilafar heard that her sultan was riding out, not to meet an enemy on the battlefield, not to secure a fortress or break a siege, but to retrieve the other woman, the newer wife. The Byzantine princess who had entered their world like a splinter enters flesh, sharp and foreign, and impossible to ignore. She went to her mother. She went to Malhan Khatun, who sat in the inner chamber with the calm of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that its cruelties were rarely new, only repeated. Nilafar asked, and her voice carried the particular kind of composure that precedes collapse, "When will our sultan return, mother? When will he come home?" And Malhan answered with the directness that had always defined her, "He will not come home, not yet. He has taken his men and gone to the monastery to bring Asporka back." Nilafar's breath caught, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that small hitch of air was an entire landscape of hurt, of jealousy that she would never allow herself to name, of devotion that had been tested too many times and was now beginning to show its cracks. She turned away from her mother, and when she reached her chamber, she closed the door and she wept. Gonya found her there, Gonya, whose tongue was as sharp as any dagger in the Osmanli armory, whose observations cut to the bone and left marks that did not heal easily. Gonya sat beside Nilafar, and she spoke in the low, deliberate tone of a woman who knows exactly which wound to press. "Asporka," she said, "has not only entered our sultan's marriage, she has entered his heart." He would not break his word, he would not leave his duties, he would not ride out in the middle of a campaign for a woman who held no place in his soul, but he has done all of these things. And what does that tell you, Nilafar? What does that tell you about where you stand? Nilafar did not answer immediately. She sat in the dim light of her chamber, her tears drying on her cheeks, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as though it were the last solid thing in a world that had begun to shift beneath her feet. And then she spoke, and her voice was no longer the voice of a woman weeping. It was the voice of a woman who had decided. "If it is war," she said, "then let it be war." Those words did not leave the room, but they did not need to. They were written in the air, they were carved into the silence. They would grow, they would bear fruit, and that fruit would be bitter for everyone who tasted it. Meanwhile, in the monastery, the world was a different kind of dark. The monastery sat among trees that had grown for centuries, their roots digging into stone that had been laid by hands long forgotten, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the midday sun could not fully penetrate. Inside, the corridors were narrow and lit by candles that threw long, trembling shadows against walls, covered in paintings of saints whose eyes seemed to follow every footstep. And through those corridors moved Asporka. She had changed her clothes. She no longer wore the garments of an Osmanli Khatun. She wore the dress of her father's people, and the fabric sat on her body like a second skin, familiar and confining at the same time. She moved through the monastery with the careful steps of a woman who was not entirely sure whether she had come home or walked into a prison of a different kind, and her eyes searched every face she passed for some sign of the world she had left behind. She came to a room that was darker than the corridors, where the air was heavy with the smell of old stone and extinguished wax. And in that room sat a man, Shahanshah Andronikos Nikolis, the emperor's shadow, the chess piece that had been placed on this board long before a sporker understood she was part of the game. He sat in a chair that was too large for the room, his hands resting on the arms of it, his face half hidden by the dim light, and when a sporker entered, when she approached with the food she had brought, when she said, "I have come," his response was not words. His response was to reach toward the candle beside him and extinguish it, plunging the room into a darkness so complete that a sporker could not see his face. In that darkness, something shifted, something was decided, something was set in motion that would not be stopped by walls or prayers or the passage of time. And outside the monastery, in the forest that surrounded it like a siege, Orhan Sahib was already moving. He had taken a small force. Turhan rode at his right hand, his eyes piercing the darkness between the trees, his sword loose in its scabbard. Behind them rode 10 men, the kind of men who did not need to be told what was about to happen, the kind of men who could read the set of their sultan's shoulders and know that mercy had been folded up and placed somewhere it would not be found tonight. They moved through the forest like water through stone, finding the gaps, the paths that no map had recorded, the ancient tracks that only hunters and fugitives knew. As they rode, Orhan Sahib spoke to Turhan, not loudly, not in the voice of a sultan issuing commands, in the voice of a man speaking to the one person in the world who did not require pretense. He said, "She is my wife, Turhan. She is my responsibility, not because she is a prize to be guarded or a treasure to be locked away, but because I gave my word. I stood before the Almighty, and I spoke the words that bound her to me and me to her, and I will not allow the world to make a lie of that promise." Turhan said nothing. He did not need to. His presence beside his sultan was itself a statement, a declaration that wherever Orhan Sahib went, whatever darkness he rode into, whatever enemy waited at the end of the road, he would not ride alone. They reached the edge of the monastery grounds as the night deepened. The trees thinned, and through the gaps they could see the stone walls, the arched windows, the faint glow of candles behind shuttered glass. Guards moved along the perimeter. Byzantine soldiers, men in armor that reflected the moonlight like the scales of sleeping dragons, their spears upright, their movements slow and regular. They did not expect what was coming. They had been told that the Osmanli Sultan was occupied with his campaign, that his attention was fixed on the fortresses to the east, that he would not spare men for the retrieval of a single woman. They were wrong. Orhan Sahib raised his hand and his men stopped. He studied the walls. He studied the guard patterns. He counted the heartbeats between each patrol's turn at the corner, measured the distance from the tree line to the nearest gate, calculated the number of men he would need to silence the outer guards before the alarm could be raised, and then he lowered his hand and his men moved. Turhan went first. He always went first. He moved across the open ground with the speed of a coursing shadow, low and silent, his blade drawn and held along the line of his forearm so that it would not catch the light. The first guard never saw him. One moment the man was standing, his spear balanced against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the trees. The next moment Turhan was behind him, one hand over his mouth, the blade finding the gap between the plates of his armor with the precision of a surgeon's instrument. The guard folded. Turhan caught him and lowered him to the ground without a sound. The second guard turned at the corner and found emptiness where his companion should have been. He opened his mouth. The breath he drew to call out was the last full breath he would ever take. Turhan's blade crossed the distance between them faster than the moonlight could follow, and the guard fell against the wall, sliding down the ancient stone, leaving a dark streak that the morning rain would wash away, but that the stones would remember. Orhan Sahib entered through the gate. His men fanned out behind him, each one moving to a predetermined position, each one carrying out a role that had been established not through orders but through years of fighting together, years of understanding how the man beside you moved, how he thought, where he would be when the moment demanded action. They flowed through the monastery's outer courtyard like floodwater through a broken dam, silent and irresistible. Inside, the corridors were narrow, and the fighting was close. A Byzantine officer emerged from a doorway, his sword half drawn, his face still wearing the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a meal. Orhan Sahib met him. Their blades crossed once, twice, and on the third exchange Orhan Sahib drove his sword forward with a thrust that carried the weight of everything he had lost and everything he was fighting to hold together, and the officer stumbled backward into the room he had emerged from, his sword clattering against the stone floor, his hands reaching for a wound that his fingers could not close. They moved deeper, through hallways, past rooms where monks pressed themselves against the walls and prayed to their saints for protection. Orhan Sahib did not touch them. He did not look at them. His war was not with men of prayer, regardless of whose god they served. His war was with the men who hid behind those prayers, who used sacred walls as shields for secular treachery. And then in the deepest part of the monastery, in a corridor that led to a chamber whose door was barred from the inside, Orhan Sahib stopped. He stood before the door and he listened, and through the thick wood he could hear the sound of breathing, more than one person. Voices, low and urgent, speaking in a language that he understood well enough to know that the conversation was about him. He did not knock. He drove his boot into the door, and the bar on the other side splintered, and the door crashed inward, and the candlelight from the corridor spilled into the chamber like the first light of creation spilling into the void. And there, standing in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and her eyes wide with something that was not quite fear and not quite relief, was a sporker. Behind her, pressed against the far wall, 2 men in the livery of the Byzantine court scrambled for weapons they had been foolish enough to set aside. Orhan was through the door before they could reach them. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his sword sweeping the first man's blade from his hand, and then reversing to press the edge against the second man's throat. The room was secured in the time it takes a candle flame to flicker. A sporker looked at Orhan Sahib, and Orhan Sahib looked at a sporker, and in the silence between them was everything that neither of them had said, the confusion of a marriage born from politics rather than choice, the slow, reluctant growth of something that might have been tenderness but that neither of them was ready to name, the pride that kept her from asking for help, the duty that kept him from admitting that his ride here was not entirely about duty. She spoke first. Because of me, she said, you have become a captive too, Orhan. You have walked into their walls. You have placed yourself where they can surround you and trap you and use you as leverage against your own people. And Orhan Sahib looked at her, and the faintest shadow of something that was not quite a smile and not quite a grimace passed across his face, and he said, a Turk is never a captive. Not in any room, not behind any wall, not in any chain forged by any hand. A Turk is never a captive. Then he took her arm, not roughly but not gently either, with the firm grip of a man who was done negotiating, done waiting, done allowing the world to dictate the terms of his own household, and he led her toward the door. But the monastery was not finished with them. As they moved through the corridors, as Orhan cleared the path ahead and the 10 men guarded the path behind, the sound reached them. Boots, many boots, the rhythmic metallic percussion of armored men moving in formation through stone hallways. Shahanshah had not left a sporker unguarded. He had merely left her lightly guarded, and the heavier guard, the real guard, the men who had been stationed in the monastery's lower levels and in the buildings adjacent, those men were now awake and moving. The first clash happened in the main hall, a wide, vaulted room with pillars of stone, and a floor of polished marble that turned red with the first blood that was spilled upon it. Byzantine soldiers poured in from 3 doorways. Orhan Sahib placed a sporker behind a pillar and drew his second blade, and then the hall became a place of iron and fury. Orhan intercepted the first wave. He moved between the pillars like a flame between trees, his sword catching the light and then disappearing as it found flesh, emerging again on the other side of a man who had not yet realized he was falling. He parried a spear thrust meant for Orhan Sahib's back, deflected the blade downward, and drove his own blade upward beneath the spearman's arm, finding the soft point where the armor did not reach, and the spearman dropped to his knees with a sound like a prayer spoken too late. Orhan Sahib fought with the precision that defined him. Every stroke had purpose. Every parry created an opening. Every opening was exploited. He did not fight like a man who enjoyed killing. He fought like a man who understood that killing was the tax that history levied upon those who sought to build something lasting, and he paid that tax without hesitation, but also without joy. His blade took a soldier across the chest, and the man fell backward into his companions, disrupting their formation. Orhan Sahib stepped into the gap, his second blade sweeping low, catching a knee, and the soldier who owned that knee collapsed sideways into another pillar. The formation broke, and once a formation broke in close quarters, it did not reform. It dissolved into individual contests, and in individual contests the Osmanli warriors had no equals. Abdul Rahman fought near the eastern doorway, his heavy blade rising and falling with the relentless rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. Tamir Boga held the western approach, his shield presenting an immovable wall against which the Byzantine soldiers crashed and fell back and crashed again. Mustafa moved through the chaos like a whisper through a crowd, his blade finding throats and wrists and the narrow gaps between helmet and gorget, where a precise thrust could end a fight before it began. The hall was theirs within minutes. The marble floor was covered with the fallen, and the candle sconces along the walls cast their dying light upon a scene that would have made a painter weep and a poet fall silent. Orhan Sahib returned to a sporker. She stood where he had placed her, her back against the pillar, her breathing rapid but controlled. She had not screamed. She had not run. She had watched the violence with the eyes of a woman who had been raised in a court where violence was discussed over dinner and commissioned over breakfast, and she understood what she was seeing, even if she did not yet understand her place within it. They left the monastery. They moved through the outer courtyard and past the walls and into the forest, and the trees closed around them like curtains closing around a stage, hiding the performance from the eyes of those who had not earned the right to witness it. Sporka rode with Orhan Sahib, not on a separate horse. With him, his arm around her waist, his hand holding the reins, her body pressed against his armor, feeling through the cold metal the warmth of the man beneath it. And as they rode, as the monastery shrank behind them, as the sounds of pursuit faded into the general murmur of the forest at night, Orhan Sahib spoke to her, and what he said was not tender, it was not romantic. It was the truth, delivered without decoration, without softening, without apology. From this day forward, he said, you will learn to be Sultan Orhan's wife, not a Byzantine princess hiding in a monastery, not a woman torn between two worlds. You will be a Sporka Khatun. You will carry that name, and you will carry the weight that comes with it, and you will not run from it again. Sporka did not answer, but she did not pull away. She sat in the circle of his arm, and she felt the horse moving beneath them, and she watched the trees pass by in the darkness, and she began the long, slow process of understanding that the life she had been born into and the life she had been given were not the same thing, and that the space between them was not a void but a bridge, and that she would have to be the one to cross it. Behind them in the forest, Turhan rode with his eyes on the shadows. He had cleaned his blade on the cloth of a fallen soldier, and the steel gleamed faintly in the darkness. He was not thinking about the fight in the monastery. That was finished. He was thinking about what came next, because Turhan always thought about what came next, and what came next he knew was worse. Yakid was still out there. The traitor, the deserter, the man whose name had become a curse in the mouths of the Osmanli faithful. Yakid, who had stood at the edge of the same grave where Burhan Faladios now lay and had smiled. Yakid, who had defected to the Byzantine side not out of conviction, but out of ambition, out of a hunger for power that could not be satisfied by the share that loyalty provided. Yakid, who now commanded a band of renegades and mercenaries that operated in the space between the two empires, answering to Shahanshah when it suited him, and answering to no one when it did not. And Yakid had been busy. The battle came before Orhan Sahib was ready for it, not at the monastery, not on the road back, but at the place where Burhan had been killed, the same clearing, the same trees, the same soil that had drunk Burhan's blood. Yakid had chosen it deliberately. He had chosen it because he knew what it meant to the Osmanli forces, knew that fighting on that ground would unsettle them, would force them to carry the weight of grief along with the weight of their weapons. Orhan Sahib's forces arrived at the clearing to find Yakid's men already positioned. They had constructed rough barricades from fallen trees and stones, and behind those barricades, they waited with crossbows and spears, and the cold patience of men who had been promised gold for every Osmanli head they delivered. The first volley came from the tree line, crossbow bolts cutting through the air with the flat, purposeful hiss that distinguished them from the singing flight of arrows. Turhan moved before the sound reached conscious thought, his body placing itself between the bolts and Orhan Sahib, his shield catching too, a third glancing off his shoulder armor with a shriek of metal on metal. He did not flinch. He shifted his weight, adjusted his position, and raised his sword, and his voice cut through the chaos with the clarity of a blade through silk. Shields forward. The Osmanli line formed, shields interlocked. The second volley hammered against the wall of wood and iron and achieved nothing, and then Orhan Sahib gave the order and the line advanced. Faladios led the charge, not Burhan. Burhan was in the ground. This Faladios was the man who carried that name forward, the man known also as Evrenos, the fierce commander who had taken upon himself the burden of his fallen predecessor's legacy, and wore it not like a title but like a wound that he refused to let heal, because the pain reminded him of what he owed. Faladios broke through the first barricade with the force of a river breaking through a dam. His sword swept the first defender from his feet. His shield drove the second backward into the sharpened stakes that had been planted behind the barricade, and then he was through, and the men behind him poured through the gap like water through broken stone. The fighting in the clearing was brutal, close, personal, the kind of fighting where you could feel your enemy's breath on your face and see the moment when the light went out of his eyes. Orhan Sahib fought in the center. He always fought in the center, not because it was the safest place but because his men needed to see him, needed to know that their sultan shared their danger, bled when they bled, suffered when they suffered. His blade rose and fell with the rhythm of a heartbeat, each stroke precise, each parry economical, each kill acknowledged with a whispered prayer that the soul departing might find whatever mercy awaited it beyond the veil of this world. And then Yakid's voice. It came from the far side of the clearing, amplified by the natural acoustics of the surrounding hills, distorted by the smoke that had begun to rise from the fires that Yakid's men had set among the trees. It was the voice of a man who had convinced himself that his betrayal was not betrayal but wisdom, that his desertion was not cowardice but strategy, and that his cruelty was not cruelty, but the natural order of the world reasserting itself. Your wives, Yakid called out, will become the feed of beasts and birds. Wait, just wait. I will make them suffer as your Ghazis suffered. I will take everything you have built and I will burn it, and from the ashes I will build a throne that even your God cannot topple. Palladios heard. Through the clash of steel and the screams of the wounded and the crackle of spreading fire, he heard, and he turned toward the voice with the focus of a hawk that has sighted its prey. He pushed through the melee, his blade clearing a path, and he reached a point where he could see Yakid standing on a raised mound of earth, his face half covered by a cloth, his arms spread as though addressing a congregation rather than a battlefield. Who are you? Palladios demanded, and his voice was raw with smoke and fury. Who are you to speak of our women, of our homes, of our God? Show yourself, face me. And Yakid reached up and pulled the cloth from his face. In the firelight, Fatima saw him. Fatima, who had followed the army because she could not be kept behind, who had positioned herself on the ridge overlooking the clearing because she trusted her own eyes more than any scout's report. Fatima saw Yakid's face revealed, and she recognized him, and the recognition struck her like a physical blow. Her hands gripped the edge of the rock she crouched behind, and the name left her mouth in a whisper that was louder than any shout. Yakid. She knew him, she knew what he had done, she knew what he was capable of doing, and in that moment of recognition, the full scope of the danger they faced became clear to her, clear in a way that tactical assessments and intelligence reports could never achieve. This was not a mercenary, this was not a hired sword. This was a man who had been inside their walls, who knew their routines, who understood their weaknesses, and who hated them with the specific burning hatred that only a former brother can possess. The battle shifted. Yakid's men, emboldened by their leader's presence, pushed back against the Osmanli advance. The barricades on the flanks held, and from behind them, a fresh volley of crossbow bolts tore into the Osmanli line. 3 men fell, then 4. Tamir Boga took a bolt through his shield arm and fought on, switching his weapon to his opposite hand with the grim determination of a man who had trained for exactly this moment. Abdul Rahman was driven back 3 paces, 5 paces, 7, before Turhan appeared at his side, and together they held the line, their blades working in concert, creating a wall of moving steel that nothing could pass through and live. Orhan Saheb saw the danger. He saw that the flanks were holding, that his center was being pushed, that Yakid was using the terrain and the fire to channel the fight into a killing ground, and so he did what he always did when the world pressed in too tightly. He pressed back harder. He called to Jarkutai, he called to Altadin, he called to the men of the reserve, the riders who had been held back behind the ridge, and he gave the order, and the order was a single word, and the word was enough. Now, the cavalry came over the ridge like the wrath of the Almighty made visible. Horses and men and steel and dust, a rolling wave of power that struck Yakid's left flank with a force that crumpled it like parchment in a fist. Jarkutai led them, his tears dried, his grief transformed into something that moved faster than a horse and cut deeper than any blade. He rode through the barricade as though it were not there, his lance finding the chest of the first man who stood against him, the impact lifting the man from his feet and carrying him backward 5 paces before the lance-broken Jarkutai drew his sword and continued without slowing. The flank collapsed, and with it, Yakid's formation began to unravel. Men who had been holding their positions with the discipline of promised gold discovered that gold means nothing when death arrives on horseback, and they broke. They ran for the trees. They dropped their weapons and their shields and they ran, and the Osmanli cavalry pursued them into the forest, and the sounds of that pursuit, the screams, the crashes, the abrupt silences that followed each scream, those sounds echoed through the hills for an hour afterward. Yakid escaped. He escaped because men like Yakid always escape, because treachery teaches its practitioners the art of disappearance, of sliding away from consequences like smoke sliding through fingers. He vanished into the deeper forest, into the network of paths and safe houses that he had prepared for exactly this eventuality, and though Palladios searched for him, though Turhan sent riders after him, though Orhan Saheb himself stood at the edge of the clearing and stared into the darkness with the intensity of a man trying to see through the fabric of the world itself, Yakid was gone. For now, but not forever. Not forever. The aftermath of the battle was its own kind of warfare. The wounded were gathered, the dead were counted. The prisoners, those who had surrendered rather than run, were brought before Orhan Saheb, and he looked at each of them, and he judged them, and those who had been conscripted against their will were separated from those who had chosen to serve Yakid, and the latter were given a choice that was not really a choice, and the night absorbed their fates as it absorbed everything else. Then came the fire. Palladios had been captured, not by the enemy on the battlefield but in a separate action, a trap that Yakid had set before the main engagement. A net, ancient and simple, the kind of trap that hunters use for wolves, had been concealed among the trees along the route that Faladios would use to reach the clearing. He had ridden into it, and the net had collapsed around him, and before his men could cut him free, Yakid's agents had overwhelmed them and dragged Faladios away. Fatima had been taken as well. She had been seized at the ridge, pulled from her observation point by hands that came from behind, and though she fought, though she drove her elbow into the face of one attacker and her knee into the groin of another, they were too many, and she was dragged down the slope and into the forest with her arms bound and her mouth gagged with a strip of rough cloth. Yakid brought them together. In a clearing deeper in the forest, far from the battlefield, far from rescue, he had prepared a spectacle. Faladios was bound to a post. The net had been removed, but ropes had replaced it, thick and tight, cutting into his arms and his chest. Oil had been poured over him. The smell of it filled the air, mingling with the smell of the forest and the distant smoke from the battlefield, creating a stench that was the olfactory signature of impending horror. Fatima was held nearby, not bound to a post but held by two men, her arms twisted behind her, her face forced forward so that she could not look away. Yakid stood between them, and in his hand he held a torch, and the flame danced in his eyes like a living thing that shared its master's malice. He spoke to Fatima. His voice was calm, conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather or the price of grain, and the contrast between that calm and the scene before her was worse than any threat he could have made. Today, he said, the man who burns will be this one. Today, you will watch. Today, you will see what happens to those who stand on the wrong side of history's turning. Fatima screamed. She screamed his name, Yakid, as though the sound of it could shame him, could reach whatever remnant of conscience still existed within him and force it to intervene. But there was no remnant. There was no conscience. There was only ambition and hatred, and the slow, methodical cruelty of a man who had long ago surrendered every part of himself that was capable of mercy. Yakid moved toward Faladios. He raised the torch. The oil on Faladios' clothes caught the reflection of the flame, and for a moment the commander looked like he was already burning, like the fire had already found him and was simply waiting for permission to consume. Fatima wept. She wept without sound, without the dramatic sobs that the storytellers of lesser tales would have given her. She wept with the quiet, relentless grief of a woman who understood that the world was not fair, had never been fair, and would never be fair, and that the only response to that unfairness was to survive it and then make it pay. And then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, came the sound that Yakid had not expected to hear. Hoofbeats. A single rider burst from the tree line, then another, then 5, then 10. Turhan at the front, his blade already drawn, his horse at full gallop, his eyes fixed on Yakid with the unwavering focus of a hawk diving toward its prey. Orhan Sahib had sent him. Orhan Sahib had read the absence of Faladios and Fatima like a general reads a map, had understood what it meant, had calculated where they would be taken, and had dispatched Turhan with a single instruction spoken in the tone of a man who would accept only one outcome. Bring them back. Turhan did not slow, he did not issue a challenge, he did not offer terms. He rode directly at Yakid, and Yakid dropped the torch and dove sideways, and the torch fell to the ground and sputtered in the damp earth and went out. The two men holding Fatima released her and reached for their weapons, but Abdul Rahman and Mustafa were already upon them, and the reach for weapons was the last voluntary action they would ever take. Turhan dismounted beside Faladios and cut the ropes with 3 precise strokes. Faladios fell forward, his legs numb from the binding, his arms shaking, the oil soaking through his clothes and dripping from his chin. But he was alive. He was alive, and his eyes burned with something that oil could not create and water could not extinguish. Fatima stood where she had been released, rubbing her wrists, her face streaked with tears and dirt and fury. She looked at the place where Yakid had stood. He was gone, again, vanished into the forest like the shadow of a cloud passing over a field. She spoke his name one more time, not as a scream, not as a curse, as a promise. Yakid, she said, and the word fell from her lips like a seed falling into prepared soil. They returned to the main camp as dawn was breaking. The sky had not cleared. It never cleared in those days. It remained grey and heavy, pressing down upon the world like the hand of a god who was waiting to see what his children would do with the mess they had made. Orhan Sahib stood at the entrance of the camp and watched them ride in, and he counted their faces, and when he saw Faladios and Fatima among them, something in his posture changed, some tension that he had been carrying in the line of his spine released by a fraction, and he turned away and walked toward his tent. Inside the tent, he stood alone for a moment, just a moment. He stood with his hands on the campaign table and his head bowed and his eyes closed, and he breathed, and in that breath was the weight of everything, the weight of Burhan's death, the weight of Asporka's flight, the weight of Nilofar's tears, the weight of Yakid's betrayal, the weight of Shahanshah's plotting and Gonya's whispered provocations, and the monastery and the battle and the fire and the net, and the bodies on the marble floor, and the blood on the clearing and the prayers over the grave. He breathed, and then he opened his eyes and he straightened, and he called for Turhan, and Turhan came, and Orhan Sahib said, "What word from the scouts? What does Shahanshah prepare?" Because the war was not over. The personal war, the political war, the military war, none of them were over. They were all merely entering their next phase, and the next phase, Orhan Sahib knew, would be worse than everything that had come before. In Bursa, in the city that the Osmanli had made their own, the tensions were building in a different way. Alauddin Sahib had returned. He rode through the gates on a horse that was lathered and spent, and in his arms he carried his son, the child pressed against his chest as though the boy were made of glass and the world were made of hammers. He rode directly to the inner chambers, and there he found Gonya. Gonya was dying. She lay on cushions that had been arranged around her, and her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on the particular translucence that comes when the body has begun its slow surrender to whatever awaits beyond. Alauddin knelt beside her. He placed his son on the cushions next to her. He took her hand, and the man who had commanded armies and governed provinces and stood unflinching before threats that would have broken lesser men, that man broke. "My Gonya," he said, "my Gonya, you cannot leave. My rose, you cannot go. I am here, and you cannot leave." But Gonya's eyes were closing, not in sleep, in something deeper, something that no voice could call her back from, no grip could anchor her against. She was slipping away, and Alauddin could feel it, could feel the gradual loosening of her fingers in his grip, could feel the world contracting around them until it contained nothing but this room, this bed, this woman, this impossible, unbearable moment. He called her name again, and again, and again, each time louder, each time more desperate, each time more aware that the loudness and the desperation changed nothing, that the volume of a man's grief does not alter the trajectory of fate, that the universe does not bargain with love, does not accept tears as currency, does not reverse its decisions because a man's heart is breaking. Gonya, Gonya, Gonya. Room was silent. The silence was its own kind of sound, the sound of a world that had just become smaller, colder, less complete. Alauddin held her hand. He held it long after there was any reason to hold it. He held it because letting go would mean acknowledging what his mind already knew but his heart refused to accept, and so he held on, and the morning light crept into the room and found him there, kneeling, broken, holding the hand of a woman who was no longer holding his. In another part of the palace, Nilafar sat alone. She had heard Alauddin's cries. She had heard them through the walls, through the corridors, through the stone and the silence, and they had settled into her like stones settling into the bed of a river. She thought about Gonya. She thought about the things Gonya had said to her, the whispered provocations, the sharp observations about a Sporker and Orhan Sahib, the words that had cut because they were true. And now Gonya was gone, and the truths she had spoken remained, hanging in the air of the palace like smoke that would not dissipate. "If it is war," Nilafar had said, "then let it be war." She still meant it, but the war she was preparing for had changed shape. It was no longer the war of a jealous wife against a rival. It was the war of a woman who understood that the palace was its own battlefield, that the domestic sphere was as dangerous as any siege, and that survival required strategy as surely as any campaign. She would survive, she would endure, she would stand. Meanwhile, Shahanshah was not idle. He never was. In his chambers, surrounded by maps and informants and the particular species of advisor that thrives in the gap between a ruler's fear and a ruler's ambition, Shahanshah was planning. His face in the candlelight was a landscape of calculation. Every line, every shadow, every movement of his eyes reflected the ceaseless machinery of a mind that never stopped computing advantage. He spoke to Damia Khan, he spoke to Mahmud, he spoke to the men who served him not out of loyalty but out of the more reliable motive of self-preservation, and he told them what he wanted, and what he wanted was simple and terrible. He wanted Orhan Sahib destroyed, not defeated, not pushed back, not negotiated with, destroyed, erased from the map and the history and the memory of every generation that would follow. "The fire inside me," Shahanshah said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had surrendered to his own hatred and found in that surrender a terrible kind of freedom. "The fire inside me will spare no one. No one." He marshaled his forces. He called in debts that were decades old. He sent riders to allies that he despised but needed, offered concessions that he had no intention of honoring, made promises that tasted like poison even as they left his mouth. And slowly, like a tide that cannot be turned back, his army gathered. Damia Khan brought his men. Mahmud brought his. They arrived at Shahanshah's camp in columns that stretched along the road for miles, their armor catching the light, their banners snapping in the wind, their horses stamping and snorting with the restless energy of animals that sensed what was coming. Orhan Sahib received the reports. He stood in his war tent, and Turhan stood beside him, and Faladios stood across the table, his clothes still smelling faintly of the oil that had nearly been his funeral pyre, and they looked at the map, and they understood. This was not a skirmish. This was not a border dispute. This was the battle, the one that would determine whether the Osmanli vision survived or perished, the one that the historians would write about in languages not yet born, the one that the poets would argue about for centuries, debating whether the outcome was decided by strategy or by fate, or by the will of the Almighty, or by the simple, stubborn refusal of certain men to accept a world that did not bend to their sense of justice. Orhan Sahib looked at the map. He placed his hand upon it, palm flat, fingers spread, as though he were pressing his will directly into the terrain itself. "Any man who has courage," he said, "any man who has strength in his heart and faith in his soul, let him come to the field and face me. Let him stand before me, not behind walls, not behind hostages, not behind treachery and hired swords. Let him stand before me, man to man, blade to blade, and let the Almighty decide between us." No one answered, no one needed to. The words hung in the tent like the smoke from the war fires that burned along the distant ridge. They hung there and they hardened, and they became part of the air itself. Orhan Sahib drew his sword. He examined its edge. He ran his thumb along the blade, not quite touching, feeling the cold that radiated from the steel. Then he sheathed it and walked out of the tent and into the grey morning. The army was assembled. Thousands of men, Turhan at his right, Faladios at his left, Jarkutai behind, Tamya Boga and Abdul Rahman and Mustafa and Altadin and Zarkan and Kilal and all the others, all the names that would be remembered, all the faces that would be painted on the walls of future mosques, all the souls that had decided that this day was a good day to matter. Across the field, Shahanshah's army waited, a mirror image, a dark reflection, the same number of men, the same quantity of steel, but different, because Shahanshah's men fought for pay or for fear or for the inertia of an empire that had been dying for so long that its death had become a kind of tradition. And Orhan Sahib's men fought for something else, something that could not be measured in gold or counted in ranks, something that had been spoken over Burhan's grave. Something that had been whispered in the dark corridors of the monastery, something that a sporker had heard in Orhan Sahib's voice when he told her who she was now, something that Nilafar carried in her heart, despite the pain, something that Fatima had promised with a single word in a forest clearing, something that Aladdin would carry forward from Gonya's bedside into whatever battle awaited him next. Something that did not have a name, but that everyone present could feel, the way you feel the change in the air before a storm, the way you feel the earth shift beneath your feet before it opens. Orhan Sahib raised his hand. The army moved forward, one step, then another. Then the steps merged into a walk, and the walk into a march, and the march into a charge, and the charge into the roar that history makes when it turns a corner and finds its next chapter waiting. Orhan Sahib's blade met the blade of Shahanshah's champion, steel on steel. The sound rang across the field, across the hills, across the rivers and the forests and the grave, and it reached the ears of every man and woman who had a stake in the outcome, and it told them that the story was not over. The story was far from over. The war was still breathing, still growing, still reaching for whatever ending the Almighty had written in the book that no human hand could open. In the distance, beyond the battlefield, beyond the hills, beyond the smoke and the fire and the steel, a wolf howled. Or perhaps it was the wind. Or perhaps it was the voice of Burhan Faladios, calling from wherever the righteous go when they leave this world, calling to the men he had loved and the cause he had died for, calling not for vengeance but for justice, because vengeance is a flame that consumes itself, but justice is a fire that lights the way forward. And the men who heard it, whether it was wolf or wind or ghost, those men tightened their grips on their swords and pressed forward into the storm. Because that is what the soldiers of Orhan Sahib do. They press forward. Always forward. Into the darkness. Into the fire. Into whatever waits. Always forward. And the world, the vast and ancient and blood-soaked world, watched them go, and held its breath, and waited to see what they would build from the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy them. The war was not over. The war had barely begun.
As the night deepened, the forest exhaled a slow, cold breath, as if the earth itself was trying to cool the fever of the blood that had been spilled upon it. The violence that had claimed Yakid and consumed the ravine was behind them, but the residue of it clung to the soldiers, a heavy, invisible ash that settled upon their shoulders and darkened their thoughts. They had made camp in a clearing shielded by ancient pines, the fires kept low, the sentries posted at the perimeter. Tarhan was out there somewhere in the blackness, a shadow keeping watch over shadows. Jarkata Sahib stood near the tree line, his twin blades sheathed but his hands resting upon their hilts, his eyes staring into the dark as though he could still see his brother's ghost walking between the trunks. In the center of the camp, near the low embers of a dying fire, Fatima sat in silence. The women who attended her, the loyal companions who had ridden through the storm of this war by her side, sat near her, speaking in hushed whispers. But when the heavy, measured footsteps of Evrenos sounded against the earth, the attendants rose without a word and melted away into the darkness, leaving the space between the fire and the trees entirely to them. Evrenos moved with the slow stiffness of a man whose body had been battered and bruised, whose skin still carried the phantom heat of the oil that Yakid had poured over him, but his eyes were entirely focused on the woman before him. He lowered his massive frame to the ground beside her and looked at her profile, illuminated by the orange glow of the embers. "My Fatima," he said, and his voice was a deep rumble, softer than the distant thunder but carrying the same undeniable weight. Fatima did not look at him immediately. She kept her gaze fixed on the fire. "You have eaten nothing," he said gently. "I have no hunger," she replied, her voice flat, exhausted by the sheer volume of emotion she had been forced to carry since the moment Barhin Faladios had been taken. Evrenos shifted closer. "My Fatima," he said again, testing the words, finding comfort in the shape of them. "When I sit in the quiet, when I think of the things we have survived, I say to myself, perhaps Orhan Sahib was right. Perhaps having children is important. Perhaps there is more to this world than the swinging of a sword and the counting of the dead." Fatima turned her head then, her eyes searching his face, looking for the jest, the irony, but finding only a startling, absolute sincerity. "Did you truly never think of this before?" she asked, her voice softening, the armor of the warrior stripping away to reveal the woman beneath. "Did you never think of having a home, of having children of your own?" Evrenos looked down at his large, calloused hands, hands that had taken life, hands that had broken bones and bent steel. "Commander Faladios had never thought of it," he said slowly, referring to the man he used to be, the title that had defined his existence before the war changed its shape. "It never once crossed my mind. Not until I saw you." Fatima looked at him, a faint, skeptical smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You want me to believe there was no one else in your life?" she asked. "That the great warrior lived entirely in a void until I appeared?" Evrenos raised his eyes and met hers, and there was no hesitation in his gaze. "Fatima," he said, "Faladios is dead. He died on the battlefield. He died in the fire. And Evrenos was born. I remember nothing of the man I was before you. You are the beginning of my memory." "It is not a complete answer, Evrenos Sahib," she whispered, though the skepticism had vanished from her voice, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest like the first light of dawn. "Do you know what I want?" he asked, leaning closer, the firelight catching the earnest hope in his eyes. "I want a daughter exactly like you, a daughter who laughs like you do and whose laughter has the power to illuminate the entire world. And after that, I want a son, a boy I can place upon a horse, a boy I can teach to hold a sword, but above all, a boy I can teach what it truly means to be brave, to be honorable. That is what I want, Fatima. That is my prayer." Fatima looked at the giant of a man beside her, a man who had faced death 1,000 times and never flinched, now rendering himself entirely vulnerable, offering her the deepest, most fragile piece of his soul. "Inshallah," she whispered, "God willing." They looked at each other, and the tension of the war, the grief of Jarkata Sahib, the looming threat of the Latin ships and the treacherous shadow of Shahanshah's legacy, all of it faded, pushed back by the simple, profound joy of the moment. They began to laugh, quietly at first, and then with a pure, unburdened relief. Fatima tilted her head back and looked up through the canopy of the pines. "Look," she said, pointing toward the heavens. "A shooting star. Did you see it?" Evrenos followed her gaze to the black canvas above, where a streak of silver had just burned its brief, brilliant path across the night. "I saw it," he said. "Where I come from, they say that when a star falls, it means either someone's prayer has just been answered, or someone's destiny has just been rewritten. That means someone has made a prayer, Fatima said softly, her eyes still on the sky. Or perhaps, Evrenos murmured, his gaze returning to her face, perhaps two people have made a prayer. Fatima lowered her head, a sudden, unfamiliar blush rising to her cheeks, and she said nothing more because nothing more was needed. The forest around them settled into a profound peace, a temporary sanctuary carved out of a world at war. But war has a way of finding its way into every sanctuary, no matter how remote. Far from the camp, hidden deep within the treacherous rock formations of a desolate mountain pass, a small fire crackled inside a cave. Orhan Sahib sat near the flames, turning a spit of roasting meat over the heat. The smell of it filled the damp air of the cave, offering a crude comfort against the biting chill of the stone. Across the fire from him sat the Shahzadi, Esporcha. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, but she was entirely distracted. Her hand kept moving to her throat, her fingers brushing against her collarbone, searching the empty space there. She patted her chest, checked the folds of her dress, her brow furrowed in quiet distress. Orhan Sahib watched her with the calm, observant eyes of a man who missed nothing. "What are you looking for on your neck?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly against the cavern walls. Esporcha's hand dropped quickly to her lap. She straightened her posture, adopting the regal, defiant mask she wore so well. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Nothing," Orhan Sahib repeated, a faint trace of amusement touching his tone. "Where is your necklace? Did you not like it? Is that why you took it off and threw it away?" Esporcha's eyes widened, her defense crumbling instantly. "No," she said, her voice rising with genuine panic. "I liked it very much. I loved it, but—" "But what?" She looked away, ashamed. Before she could finish her sentence, Orhan Sahib reached into the leather pouch at his belt. His hand emerged holding a chain of silver, at the end of which hung the magnificent, intricate pendant she had been frantically searching for. The silver caught the firelight, flashing like a captured star. Esporcha gasped. She leaned forward, staring at the jewelry. "This necklace, but this is my necklace. How do you have it? How did you?" She reached out to take it from him, but Orhan Sahib pulled his hand back just an inch, out of her reach. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense, carrying the weight of the oaths he had sworn and the destiny he was forging. "This," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding resonance, "this is what we call takdir, destiny, and because it is destiny it means you must never, ever take it off again." Esporcha stared at the necklace, and the walls of the cave seemed to fall away. She remembered the moment he had first placed it around her neck. She remembered the weight of it, the cold silver warming against her skin, the way his hands had lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. And then she remembered the desperate, humiliating moment she had been forced to surrender it, bartering the only thing of value she possessed just to secure a horse to ride, to escape, to survive. "Destiny," she whispered, the word tasting like a confession. "It is true. It is destiny. I had to give it away to get a horse. I had nothing else. But when I handed it over, Orhan, my heart broke. I was so sad to let it go." Orhan Sahib's expression softened. The commander, the spy, the executioner of justice faded, leaving only the husband. "Did you truly like it that much?" he asked. Esporcha nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "If I told you the truth," she said softly, "you would not believe me." "Tell me," he urged. "Perhaps I will believe you." She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. "We were enemies then," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We were fighting on opposite sides of a war that seemed like it would consume us both. But even then I had a dream. In the dream we were not enemies. In the dream we had married. And the strangest thing, Orhan, the thing that makes me tremble even now, is that in my dream, my bridal dress and this exact necklace were exactly as they are. I saw this necklace before you ever gave it to me." Orhan Sahib listened, his eyes never leaving her face. "Then it means your dream has come true," he said. Esportia managed a small, self-deprecating smile. I used to tell myself it was a nightmare. Orhan Sahib smiled back, the rare, genuine smile that he reserved only for her. We should call it destiny, he corrected her gently. Will you help me put it on? She asked, lifting her hair from the nape of her neck. On one condition, Orhan Sahib said, his voice firming into a vow, that you promise never to take it off again, no matter what happens, no matter how dark the road becomes. I promise, she whispered, I will never take it off. Orhan Sahib rose from his place by the fire. He walked around the flames, his shadow towering against the cave wall, and stopped behind her. He reached around her neck, the silver chain cool against her skin, and carefully fastened the clasp. The click of the metal was small, but in the silence of the cave, it sounded like the sealing of a pact, the locking of a gate that could never be reopened. There, he said, stepping back, this is how you must listen to your husband. Esportia touched the pendant where it rested against her collarbone, a profound, radiant happiness settling over her features. For a moment, she forgot her father, the Shahanshah, imprisoned and broken. She forgot the Latin fleet, the Byzantine armies, the blood and the mud, and the endless, grinding machinery of the war. She had her necklace. She had her husband. She had her destiny. But destiny is a blade that cuts both ways, and while it brought warmth to a cave in the wilderness, it brought a freezing terror to the great palace of Bursa. Far away, beneath the high ceilings and grand arches of the Ottoman capital, Nilüfer lay in her bed. The night outside was black and featureless, the wind howling around the minarets like a chorus of grieving women. Inside, the chamber was warm, but Nilüfer was shivering. Her sleep was not a refuge, it was a battleground. In the grip of a powerful nightmare, she found herself rising from her bed. The room was unnaturally silent. She reached out her hand, expecting to find the solid, comforting presence of Orhan beside her, but the sheets were cold. The space was empty. Orhan, she called out in the dream, her voice sounding hollow, as though it were being swallowed by the stone walls. She stood up, her bare feet touching the cold marble floor. She moved toward the heavy wooden door of her chamber, panic beginning to bloom in her chest. As she reached it, the door swung open on its own, its hinges groaning like the lid of a tomb. She stepped through it, moving into the corridor, searching the shadows. Orhan, she called again. She walked forward, passing through another door, stepping into a room bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. She turned, expecting to see her husband, but instead the breath was driven from her lungs. Standing before a tall, ornate mirror was the Shahzadi Esportia. Esportia was brushing her hair, humming a quiet, triumphant melody, her reflection staring back with cold, calculating eyes. Nilüfer froze, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped in the paralyzing gravity of the nightmare. Then a sound broke the silence, the thin, sharp cry of a baby. Nilüfer spun around. In the corner of the room sat a wooden cradle, intricately carved, draped in fine silks. The crying was coming from inside it. Her maternal instinct overriding her terror, Nilüfer rushed to the cradle. She reached out with trembling hands and pulled back the silk blanket, expecting to see the face of her son. The cradle was empty. The crying continued, echoing from the corners of the room, but there was no child. What is happening? Nilüfer gasped, spinning around wildly. What is happening? She ran toward the door to escape, but as she reached the threshold, the heavy oak slammed shut in her face with a deafening crack. She pounded her fists against the wood, screaming, but the sound was trapped in her throat. Behind her, another door groaned open. She turned, her back pressed against the wood. Through the new doorway, she saw Esportia standing in the center of a different room and walking toward her, his face soft with an affection that tore at Nilüfer's heart, was Orhan Sahib. Orhan, Nilüfer tried to scream, but no sound came out. Esportia reached out and took Orhan's hands. Orhan, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the dreamscape, there is something very important I must tell you. "Speak, my sultana," Orhan Sahib replied, his voice full of warmth. "We are going to have a child," Esportia said, her eyes shining. "Are you telling the truth?" Orhan Sahib asked, a joyous disbelief washing over his features. "It is the absolute truth," Esportia said, stepping closer to him. "A child from our life, from our blood. He will be ours and ours alone." Orhan Sahib wrapped his arms around Esportia, pulling her into a deep, passionate embrace. In the doorway, Nilufer collapsed to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, hot and stinging. "No," she wept, the silence of her nightmare breaking into a ragged, guttural sob. "No, Orhan, no." She reached out her hand toward them, but the door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute, suffocating darkness. Nilufer woke with a violently sharp intake of breath. She bolted upright in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her face was drenched in cold sweat, her hands gripping the silk sheets so tightly her knuckles were white. "Astagfirullah," she gasped, the prayer tearing from her lips in a desperate plea for sanctuary. "Astagfirullah, I seek forgiveness from Allah." She pressed her hands to her face, the tears from the dream bleeding into reality. The terror was still sitting heavy on her chest, the image of Orhan holding Esportia, the sound of the empty cradle burning in her mind. "O Allah, grant peace to my heart," she wept, rocking back and forth in the darkness. "O Allah, I cannot bear this. Grant me strength. O Allah, grant me strength." The door to her chamber opened, and the light from the hallway spilled across the floor. "Mother!" Nilufer froze. She wiped her face frantically with the back of her hands, trying to erase the evidence of her breaking heart before the boy stepped fully into the room. Suleiman, her eldest son, stood in the doorway, his young face drawn with worry. "Mother, what is wrong? Are you all right?" he asked, walking quickly to the side of her bed. Nilufer forced a smile, though her lips trembled. "I am fine, my son," she said, her voice shaking. "Nothing has happened, I am fine." Suleiman looked at her, his eyes far older than his years. "You were thinking of Baba, were you not?" he asked, using the word for father. Before Nilufer could answer, smaller footsteps padded rapidly across the marble floor. Qasim, her younger son, ran into the room and climbed onto the edge of the bed. "Has Baba returned, mother?" Qasim asked, his eyes wide with innocent hope. Nilufer pulled Qasim into her arms, holding him tightly against her chest, drawing strength from the physical reality of his small, warm body. "He will return, my son," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "Your Baba will return. Inshallah, he will return." Suleiman stood rigid beside the bed, his small hands curled into fists. "This is all happening because of us," he said, his voice dropping into a dark, angry register that chilled Nilufer's blood. "But if anything happens to Baba, if he is hurt because of that woman, I will never forgive her. Never." Nilufer reached out and pulled Suleiman to her side, wrapping her other arm around him so she held both her sons in a fierce, protective embrace. "Nothing will happen to your father," she said, her voice finding its steel, the authority of a queen rising above the terror of the nightmare. "He is Orhan. He will come back. He will come back to us." She kissed them both, holding them in the quiet of the room, while outside the wind continued to howl, and the dark machinery of the world ground endlessly onward. And far away, back in the desolate mountains, the reality of Orhan Sahib and Esportia was far less glamorous than the nightmare Nilufer had envisioned. The fire in the cave had burned down to glowing red coals. The air had grown bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps through wool and leather and settles directly into the bones. Esportia lay on the ground, wrapped in her cloak, but she could not sleep. The rock beneath her was unforgiving, digging into her ribs and her hips. She tossed to her left side. She sighed. She rolled onto her back. She grunted. She flipped onto her right side, pulling the cloak tighter around her neck. From the other side of the dying fire, a low, rhythmic sound broke the silence. It was Orhan Sahib. He was laughing. Esportia sat up, her hair falling wildly over her shoulders, her eyes narrowing in indignation. "Are you laughing at me?" she demanded. Orhan Sahib sat up, leaning back against the cavern wall, a genuine smile playing on his lips. "Come here," he said, patting the ground beside him. "Come and sleep next to me. You are a Shahzadi. You are not used to sleeping on these hard rocks." Esportia crossed her arms, her pride flaring. "So now you are thinking about your wife," she said, her tone defensive. "I thought you were angry with me." Orhan Sahib's smile faded, replaced by a quiet, serious intensity. "I am angry with you," he said, his voice steady. "But you must understand this, Esportia. From now on, you and I are one. Even when I am angry with you, I am still thinking of you. You are my wife. My anger does not erase my duty to you, nor does it erase what you mean to me." Esportia lowered her eyes, the defiance draining out of her. "It is because of my father," she whispered, the guilt finally catching up to her. "Orhan, I know that my actions have put you and your soldiers in terrible danger. I acted blindly. I apologize to you for everything." Orhan Sahib looked at her, seeing the vulnerability she so rarely showed. "From now on," he said softly, "before you let yourself be carried away by your emotions, I want you to think twice. Is that possible?" He turned his face away, looking back toward the mouth of the cave, giving her space to absorb the reprimand. Esportia looked at his broad back, at the armor that he wore even in sleep, at the man who had captured her, conquered her people, and somehow laid claim to her soul. In her heart, a silent, desperate monologue played out. "I do not listen to my emotions," Orhan asterisk, she thought, the words echoing in the private chamber of her mind. "But how can this be? How is it possible that I can hate you so completely for what you have done to my father and my empire? And at the exact same moment, love you so fiercely that it feels as though my heart will tear itself apart?" She did not say the words aloud. She did not need to. The truth of them was already written in the space between them. She stood up, pulling her cloak around her shoulders, and walked around the dying fire. She sat down beside Orhan Sahib, leaning against him. "I am very cold," she murmured. Orhan Sahib did not speak. He simply lifted his arm and wrapped his heavy wool mantle around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. Esportia rested her head against his armor, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. The rocks beneath them were still hard, the night was still freezing, and the war was still waiting for them outside the mouth of the cave. But in that small circle of warmth, surrounded by enemies and haunted by destiny, they found a fragile, fleeting peace. And so, Nazreen, we leave them in the dark. We leave Evrenos dreaming of a son. We leave Fatima watching the stars. We leave Nilufer weeping for a future she fears is slipping away. We leave Suleiman swearing an oath of vengeance. And we leave Orhan and Esportia, two enemies bound by a necklace of silver and a destiny written by God, sleeping in a cave while the world prepares to burn. The 10 days are counting down. The Latin ships are cutting through the black waters of the Mediterranean. The traitor within the camp breathes the same air as the heroes he intends to destroy. The great storm is gathering, massing on the horizon like a wall of iron and thunder, and when it breaks, it will spare no one. The dawn did not break. It bled into the sky. It came as a slow, bruised light that crept over the jagged peaks of the mountains, illuminating a world that seemed entirely exhausted by its own cruelty. The rain from the previous day had stopped, leaving behind a thick, clinging mist that swallowed the valleys and turned the forests into oceans of white vapor. It was the 5th day. 5 days since the 10-day countdown had begun. 5 days since the shadow of the Latin fleet had fallen across the future of the Ottoman state. And in that mist, moving with a speed that defied the treacherous terrain, rode Tarhan. He did not stop to rest. He did not stop to eat. His horse, its coat slick with sweat and foam, pushed through the freezing mud, its breath plumbing in the cold air like the exhaust of some great mythical beast. Tarhan's eyes were fixed on the horizon, his mind locked entirely upon the hidden pocket in his belt, far to the south. Those were the words Orhan Sahib had pulled from the mouth of Kuleds. Those were the words that would unlock the trap. Then, as he crested the final ridge, The mist parted just enough to reveal the wooden palisades of Altadin Sahib's outpost. Tarhan rode through the gates before the sentries could even draw breath to challenge him. He slid from the saddle while the horse was still moving, his boots hitting the mud heavily, and he walked straight toward the command tent. Altadin Sahib stepped out to meet him, his face etched with the hard lines of a man who had slept in his armor for a week. Tarhan did not speak a word of greeting. He simply reached into his tunic, extracted the sealed parchment, and pressed it into Altadin Sahib's hand. "Send it," Tarhan whispered, his voice cracking from the wind and the dust of the road. "Send it to the Sultan. Now." Altadin Sahib nodded once, turned, and shouted for his fastest remaining rider. The network held. The chain was unbroken. The message was moving again. But while the message moved towards salvation, a different kind of movement was happening in the shadows of that very same outpost. A movement born of treachery. Jarkata Sahib had not slept. For 3 nights he had watched Mustafa. He had watched from the rooftops, from the shadows of the armory, from the gaps between the supply tents. He had watched with the cold, unblinking patience of a predator whose grief had been distilled into absolute focus. And then, in the gray hour just before the camp stirred to life, Mustafa made his move. Jarkata Sahib saw him slip out of his quarters, wrapped in a dark cloak, moving with a cautious, deliberate silence that no innocent man ever possessed. Mustafa bypassed the main sentries, slipping through a narrow gap in the eastern palisade and disappeared into the fog-drenched woods. Jarkata Sahib followed. He made no sound. He was a ghost stalking a shadow. He moved from tree to tree, keeping his distance, letting the mist conceal him while his eyes remained locked on the traitor's back. Deep in the woods, near a ruined stone shrine that had long been reclaimed by the forest, Mustafa stopped. A moment later, another figure emerged from the fog. A Byzantine scout. The scout wore the colors of Daimir Khan's vanguard. Jarkata Sahib crouched behind the rotting trunk of a fallen oak, his hands resting upon the hilts of his twin blades. He could not hear all their words, but he did not need to. He saw Mustafa reach into his cloak. He saw the gleam of silver coins passing from the scout's hand to Mustafa. He saw the exchange of rolled parchment, the absolute, undeniable proof of betrayal. Jarkata Sahib drew his blades. The sound of the steel leaving the leather scabbards was a whisper, but in the profound silence of the forest, it was loud enough to make Mustafa turn. But turning was all he had time to do. Jarkata Sahib descended upon them like the wrath of the heavens. He did not shout. He uttered no battle cry. His silence was more terrifying than any roar. The Byzantine scout reached for his sword, but Jarkata Sahib's right blade was already in motion, a blinding arc of silver that sheared through the scout's neck before the man's weapon had even cleared its sheath. The scout fell, his blood painting the white mist red. Mustafa stumbled backward, tripping over the roots of the shrine, his eyes wide with a terror that hollowed out his face. "Jarkata Sahib," he gasped, raising his empty hands. "Wait, let me explain." Jarkata Sahib stepped over the twitching body of the scout. He walked slowly, his twin blades angled toward the earth, the blood dripping from the right edge in a slow, rhythmic beat. "Explain," Jarkata Sahib said, his voice a low, grating rasp. "Explain how Yakid knew where we would be. Explain how Barhan Faladios was ambushed and whipped until his skin hung in ribbons. Explain how my brother Boran was slaughtered because our secrets were sold for a handful of Byzantine silver." Mustafa scrambled backward in the mud, crying, weeping, the pathetic display of a man who realizes that his cunning has run out. "It was not me. I had no choice. They threatened my family, Jarkata. They said they would burn my village. I only gave them scraps. I never meant for Boran to die. I swear it by Allah." "Do not invoke his name," Jarkata Sahib snarled, stepping closer, the shadow of his massive shoulders falling over the cowering traitor. "You sold the blood of your brothers. You drank from our cups, you prayed in our ranks, and then you handed us to the fire." Next, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the fog. Evrenos, Fatima, and Barhan Faladios emerged from the tree line. They had followed Jarkata Sahib's trail, alerted by the sudden absence of the man they knew was hunting the traitor. They stepped into the clearing and saw the scene. The dead scout, the weeping Mustafa, the twin blades of Jarkata Sahib gleaming in the pale morning light. Burhan Falladio stood tall, though his back was still wrapped in bandages, his face pale from the agony he had endured in Yakid's cave. He looked at Mustafa, and in Burhan's eyes there was no anger. There was only a vast, crushing disappointment. "You," Burhan whispered, the word carrying more weight than a blow from a war hammer. "I trusted you with my flank. I trusted you with my life." Mustafa looked at Burhan, then at Fatima, then at Evrenos, searching their faces for mercy, for hesitation, for the camaraderie they had once shared. He found nothing but stone. He found the cold, impenetrable walls of justice. Jarkata Sahib raised his left blade and pointed it at Mustafa's chest. "We are at war," he said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "A war for our existence. And the penalty for treason in the face of annihilation is not forgiveness. It is eradication." Mustafa opened his mouth to scream, but the scream never materialized. Jarkata Sahib's twin blades moved in a simultaneous, devastating cross-strike. The steel sang its binary hymn. The deed was done. The traitor fell forward into the mud, his silver coins spilling from his pockets, scattering across the earth, worthless, meaningless, a monument to the ultimate futility of betrayal. Jarkata Sahib stood over the body, breathing heavily. He looked up at the sky, at the mist that was finally beginning to burn away as the sun rose higher. For Boran, he whispered, "The debt is paid." But the hole in his chest, the space where his brother had lived, did not close. Vengeance had delivered its promise, but it had brought no peace. It never did. Evrenos stepped forward and placed his heavy hand on Jarkata Sahib's shoulder. "It is done, my brother," Evrenos said quietly. "The rot has been cut out. Now the body must heal. We must prepare for what is coming." And what was coming was already moving across the maps of empires. In the great palace of Bursa, the doors to the strategy room burst open. Sultan Arhan stood at the head of the heavy oak table, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who had not slept, who had existed entirely on the fumes of duty and prayer. Around him stood his most trusted minds. Zarkin, calm and calculating. Killil, the master of maps. Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga, the commanders of the fleet. And joining them now was Al-Aliuddin Sahib, carrying the fresh reports of troop movements from the eastern frontiers. The rider from Altuddin Sahib's outpost had arrived just moments before, his horse collapsing at the palace gates, the boy barely able to walk as he delivered the encoded parchment. Sultan Arhan had decoded it himself, his hands moving quickly, his eyes translating the cipher that only he and Arhan Sahib understood. He laid the parchment flat upon the table. The silence in the room was absolute. Far to the south, Sultan Arhan said aloud, the words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Killil immediately unrolled the great maritime map of the Mediterranean and the Aegean, spreading it over the table and weighting the corners with iron daggers. He leaned over the parchment, tracing the coastlines with a long, wooden pointer. "If they are coming from Venice and Genoa," Killil said, his eyes scanning the intricate lines of the straits and the islands, "and their rendezvous point is far to the south of our immediate coastal defenses. They will avoid the open waters where our scouts patrol. They need a deep-water harbor, a place shielded from the winds, large enough to hold 2 combined fleets, but hidden enough to organize before they strike Bursa." Zarkin stepped forward, his mind already running the mathematical probabilities, calculating wind speeds, draft depths, and the logistical requirements of a massive armada. "Look here," Zarkin said, tapping a specific indentation on the map. "The Bay of Megara. It is deep. It is sheltered by the southern peninsulas. It is exactly the kind of staging ground Andronikos would negotiate for his Latin allies. If they anchor there, they can combine their forces, load the final provisions, and ride the northern currents directly into the heart of our territory." Sultan Arhan stared at the map, visualizing the ships, the sails, the thousands of armored men preparing to bring the wrath of the Pope to his shores. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga. "How quickly can our ship sail?" the Sultan demanded. Tamir Boga did not hesitate. "The 15 galleys are ready, my Sultan. The Greek fire is loaded. The oarsmen are at their benches. If we sail with the evening tide, we can reach the bay before the Genoese and Venetian fleets have fully merged. But my Sultan, we are 15 ships. They will be 50, perhaps 100. "I do not ask you to count their numbers, Tamir Boga," Sultan Orhan replied, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried the absolute authority of the Ottoman throne. "I ask you to burn them. If they combine, we are lost. We must strike them while they are dropping anchor, while they are disorganized, while they are expecting a safe harbor. We will turn their rendezvous point into a graveyard of ash and iron." Abdul Rahman slammed his fist against his chest. "We will not return until the sea turns black with their ashes," he vowed. Sultan Orhan nodded. "Then go. May Allah guide your sails and steady your hands. The survival of this empire sails with you tonight." As the commanders rushed from the room to unleash the Ottoman navy, Sultan Orhan remained at the table, looking down at the small piece of parchment. 5 words. 5 words extracted by a man living in the belly of the beast. Orhan Sahib. He thought of the spy, of the sacrifice, of the sheer, unimaginable nerve it took to walk the enemy's halls and steal their salvation. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for the man who wore the mask, a prayer that the mask would not become a death shroud. After that, the scene shifts back to the wilderness, far from the maps and the strategy rooms, where the immediate, grinding reality of the war continued its relentless march. The morning mist had burned away, leaving a cold, biting wind sweeping through the mountain pass. Orhan Sahib, dressed in the armor of the Byzantine soldier Clems, was riding at the head of a small escort. Behind him rode a sportia. They had left the sanctuary of the cave, returning to the harsh demands of the roles they were forced to play. Andronikos had ordered Clems to transport the Shahzadi to a secure location, to keep her contained while the war unfolded. And so, Orhan Sahib rode, surrounded by 6 heavily armed Byzantine guards assigned to assist him, playing the loyal captor to the woman who wore his destiny around her neck. Asportia rode in silence, her hood pulled up against the wind, her hands gripping the reins. Beneath the heavy wool of her cloak, the silver pendant rested against her skin, a secret fire that warmed her against the freezing air. She kept her eyes on Orhan Sahib's broad back, watching the way he sat in the saddle, the way his hand rested near the hilt of his sword, constantly vigilant, constantly aware of the guards riding beside them. She knew the danger he was in. She knew that if these men discovered who he truly was, they would hack him to pieces on this very mountain path. And so she played her part. She played the angry, defiant prisoner, glaring at the guards, refusing to speak, maintaining the illusion that kept her husband alive. They reached a narrow crossing where the path hugged the edge of a sheer cliff, the rocks falling away into a dizzying gorge below. The lead Byzantine guard, a coarse man with a scarred cheek, pulled his horse alongside Orhan Sahib. "We should push the pace," Clems, the guard, grunted, spitting into the gorge. "Mahmud's forces are supposed to be patrolling these lower ridges, but I don't trust the shadows out here. The Ottoman dogs are everywhere." Orhan Sahib did not look at the man. He kept his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "The pace is fine," he said coldly. "The horses need their footing. If the Shahzadi falls into this ravine, Andronikos will have all our heads on spikes." The guard sneered but dropped back into formation, intimidated by the quiet, lethal authority that Clems exuded. Orhan Sahib exhaled slowly. He hated this. He hated the uniform he wore, he hated the language he had to speak, but most of all, he hated that he had to treat a sportia as a captive while surrounded by men he desperately wanted to kill. He calculated the odds of drawing his sword and slaughtering all 6 guards right there on the cliffside. He could do it. He knew he could do it. But it would break his cover, it would ruin his access, and the war was not over. As the night deepened, They made camp in a ruined fortress that clung to the side of the mountain, a relic of some forgotten empire. The Byzantine guards lit a fire and sat around it, tearing at dried meat and passing a skin of sour wine, their laughter harsh and ugly in the dark. Orhan Sahib sat apart from them, leaning against a crumbling stone wall, his sword resting across his knees. He watched them with eyes that held no mercy, only patience. Esportia was seated near him, wrapped in her blankets, pretending to sleep. But when the guards grew loud and distracted, arguing over the dice they were rolling in the dirt, she opened her eyes and looked at Orhan Sahib. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older, harder, a man carved from the very stone of the mountains. She shifted slightly, her hand reaching out beneath the cover of her cloak until her fingers brushed against his arm. The touch was so light, so momentary, that the guards never noticed. But Orhan Sahib felt it. He felt the warmth of her fingers through the leather of his bracer, and he turned his head just a fraction of an inch, his eyes meeting hers. In that single silent look, 1,000 words were spoken. "I am with you," her eyes said. "I am here," his eyes answered. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it was an ocean filled with enemies, a chasm they could only bridge with glances and secret touches. Yet it was enough. It had to be enough. Far below the mountains, down in the valleys and across the plains, the gears of the great war machine were accelerating. In the Kanka, Andronikos stood before the massive hearth in his command chamber. Shahanshah, still broken, still carrying the invisible chains of his grandson's betrayal, sat slumped in a chair nearby, staring into the flames with eyes that had seen too much ruin. Damir Khan stood at the table, pointing to the deployment markers. "The Ottoman border forces are shifting," Damir Khan reported, his voice tight with anticipation. "They are pulling back from the eastern ridges. It is exactly as you predicted, Jahanpana. They are trying to reinforce their coastal garrisons, but they are too late. Our vanguard is already moving to cut off their retreat." Andronikos smiled, the smile of a wolf that has heard the snap of the trap. "Let them shift," the Shahzada said, turning away from the fire. "Let them run toward the coast. They are running straight into the jaws of the Pope's armada. By the time they realize the Latin fleet has already secured the southern bay, our land forces will hit them from behind. We will crush them against the sea." He walked over to Shahanshah, leaning down so his face was level with the old man's hollow eyes. "Do you see, grandfather?" Andronikos whispered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "Do you see what I have built? I have united the divided churches. I have summoned the fleets of Venice and Genoa. I am doing what you never had the strength to do. I am wiping the Ottoman stain from the map of the world." Shahanshah did not blink. He looked at his grandson, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like dust blowing across a tomb. "You have built nothing, Andronikos. You have only invited monsters into our house. And when the monsters are done eating our enemies, they will eat us." Andronikos sneered, standing up and turning his back on the old man. "You are a relic," he said dismissively, "a ghost haunting a world that no longer needs you." But Andronikos did not know that he was the one being hunted by ghosts. He did not know that the trap he believed he had set was already unraveling, piece by piece, unstitched by the hands of men who operated in the shadows, who carried coded messages through the mist, who executed traitors in the dawn, who sailed against impossible odds with nothing but the fire of their faith to light the way. Then out on the dark, churning waters of the Aegean, the true storm began. The 15 Ottoman galleys slipped out of the harbor at Mudanya. They carried no lanterns. They beat no drums. The oarsmen, their backs glistening with sweat in the freezing night, pulled the massive wooden oars with a synchronized, silent rhythm that drove the heavy ships through the black water like spears thrown into the dark. Abdul Rahman stood at the prow of the lead ship, the salt spray lashing his face, his hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly the timber groaned. Beside him, Tamir Boga watched the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the wind. Below the decks, in the belly of the ships, The clay pots of Greek fire were secured in their iron racks, waiting. The archers sat in the darkness, checking their bowstrings. The swordsmen sharpened their blades with whetstones, the repetitive scraping sound blending with the crash of the waves against the hulls. They were sailing into the teeth of the Leviathan. They were sailing toward the Bay of Megara, toward the combined might of Venice and Genoa, toward a fleet that outnumbered them 5-1. They knew the odds. They knew that many of them, perhaps all of them, would not see the sun rise. But they also knew that if they did not burn those ships tonight, the empire of Osman, the dream of Orhan, the future of their children, would be extinguished forever. And back in Bursa, inside the quiet sanctuary of the palace, Nilüfer sat up in her bed. She had not slept since the nightmare. She walked to the window and looked out over the city. The minarets stood tall and unyielding against the starry sky. She thought of her sons, Suleiman and Qasim, sleeping safely in their chambers. She thought of Gonza, healing in the wing across the courtyard, holding the newborn child that represented the continuation of their line. And she thought of Orhan, her husband, the Sultan, who carried the weight of all these lives upon his shoulders. "O Allah," she whispered into the cold night air, her voice steady now, stripped of the terror of the dream and replaced by the profound, enduring strength of an Ottoman queen. "O Allah, protect our men on the water. Protect our men in the mountains. Protect the spy who walks in the darkness and the warriors who fight in the light." The countdown was no longer a matter of days. It was a matter of hours. The Latin ships were dropping anchor in the south. The Ottoman galleys were cutting through the waves. Jarkata Saheb was wiping the blood of the traitor from his blades. Orhan Saheb was watching the Byzantine guards sleep, his hand resting near his sword. Andronikos was staring at his maps, dreaming of glory. The convergence was imminent. The collision of empires was seconds away. As the night deepened, the wind began to howl across the sea, a fierce, screaming gale that tore the foam from the waves and drove the clouds across the moon. It was the sound of history being written. It was the sound of destiny arriving to collect its due. The swords are drawn, the fires are lit, the prayers are spoken. There is no turning back, not for anyone. The storm is here. The sea did not care about the Pope. It did not care about the Shahanshah, or Andronikos, or the union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. The sea was an ancient, indifferent god that swallowed iron and wood and flesh with the same cold appetite it had possessed since the dawn of creation. And as the 15 Ottoman galleys cut through the pitch-black waters of the Aegean, sliding past the jagged teeth of the coastal reefs, the sea offered no warning to the armada anchored in the Bay of Megara. It was the hour of the wolf, that profound, terrifying stretch of night just before the false dawn, when the human body is at its weakest and the mind is heavy with sleep. In the bay, the Latin fleet lay like a floating city. 50 Venetian galleons and Genoese warships, their massive masts scraping the stars, their hulls bloated with armored marines, siege engines, and the arrogant certainty of a crusade that believed it was ordained by the heavens. They had dropped anchor only hours ago, exhausted from the long voyage, their crews sleeping on the decks, their watchmen lulled into complacency by the belief that the Ottoman navy was too small, too primitive, and too blind to find them. They did not know that Sultan Orhan's eyes were everywhere. They did not know about the intelligence extracted by Orhan Saheb in the heart of the Kanka. And they did not know that Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga were standing at the prows of the lead Ottoman galleys, staring at the silhouette of the Latin armada with the cold, unblinking focus of executioners. Abdul Rahman raised his hand. He did not shout. A shout would carry over the water. He simply raised his hand, and the signal was passed from ship to ship. The rhythm of the oars changed. The beat became faster, harder, a driving, aggressive pulse that tore the water to white foam. The 15 Ottoman galleys surged forward, their bronze-tipped rams cutting through the waves like arrows loosed from a giant's bow. Below the decks, the gunners struck their flint and steel. The sparks caught the oil-soaked rags. The firing tubes were primed. Tamir Boga drew his sword. The blade hissed against the leather scabbard, a sound that seemed to cut the night itself. For the empire, he whispered, the words lost in the rushing wind. For the Sultan. Then the collision. It was not a single sound, but a cataclysm of splintering timber, shrieking metal, and the explosive roar of impact. The lead Ottoman galley slammed directly into the broadside of a massive Venetian warship. The bronze ram sheared through the thick oak hull as if it were parchment, driving deep into the belly of the enemy vessel. The Venetian ship groaned, tilting violently, its sleeping crew thrown across the decks in a sudden, brutal awakening. Before the Latins could even grasp the nightmare that had descended upon them, Abdul Rahman dropped his hand. Unleash the fire, he roared, his voice finally tearing through the silence, loud as thunder. The brass siphons mounted on the prows of the Ottoman ships hissed, and then the night was obliterated by a blinding, roaring torrent of liquid flame. The Greek fire erupted, an unnatural, clinging inferno that shot across the water and washed over the Latin hulls. It did not just burn, it devoured. It stuck to the wood, to the sails, to the armor of the screaming Marines. Water could not extinguish it, water only made it spread. Within seconds, the Bay of Megara was transformed from a dark sanctuary into a boiling cauldron of hellfire. The Ottoman galleys moved like wolves among a herd of blind cattle. They did not stop to board. They did not stop to fight hand-to-hand. Tamir Boga commanded his helmsman to sheer away from the burning Venetian ship and drive straight toward a cluster of Genoese galleys anchored too closely together. The Ottoman oarsmen pulled with a supernatural strength, fueled by the adrenaline of the slaughter. The ship rammed the nearest Genoese vessel, shattering its oars, and again the firing tubes unleashed their liquid hell. The fire leaped from the Genoese ship to the one anchored beside it, the flames climbing the rigging, turning the massive canvas sails into towering sheets of fire that illuminated the bay in a terrifying, apocalyptic daylight. Latin sailors, burning alive, threw themselves over the railings into the sea. But the sea itself was on fire, the oil spreading across the surface of the water, creating a burning lake that swallowed the drowning men. The screams were deafening, a chorus of absolute, unmitigated agony that echoed off the cliffs of the bay. Abdul Rahman ordered his ship to swing around the flank of the armada. A Venetian captain, finally rallying his panicked archers, commanded them to fire upon the Ottoman vessel. A volley of arrows rained down, thudding into the wooden shields of the Ottoman crew, but before a second volley could be loosed, Abdul Rahman's gunners fired a concentrated burst of Greek fire directly onto the Venetian archer's deck. The men dissolved into pillars of screaming ash. It was not a battle, it was a cremation. The armada that Andronikos had summoned, the great union of Catholic and Orthodox might, the crusade blessed by the Pope himself, was burning to cinders before a single soldier could set foot on Ottoman soil. The smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black, choking the stars, rising like a monument to the wrath of Sultan Orhan. As the night deepened, the destruction only amplified. The fire reached the powder magazines of a heavy galleon, and the resulting explosion tore the ship in half, sending a shockwave across the water that rattled the teeth of every man in the bay. Tamir Boga watched the ship disintegrate, his face painted orange by the inferno, his eyes reflecting the total annihilation of the enemy. They had done it. 15 ships had sailed into the maw of the beast, and they had broken its teeth. Next, the scene shifts far to the north, away from the burning sea, to the freezing, jagged peaks of the mountains where the war was fought not with ships and fire, but with masks and whispers. Orhan Sahib sat by the crumbling wall of the ruined fortress. The Byzantine guards were finally asleep, their snores mixing with the whistling of the mountain wind. Asportia lay nearby, her breathing steady, the silver necklace resting against her collarbone beneath her cloak. Orhan Sahib did not sleep. He could not. His mind was calculating the time, the distance, the probability that Tarhan had reached the outpost, the probability that the message had reached Bursa. Suddenly, his eyes snapped toward the narrow mountain pass leading up to the ruins. He heard nothing, but he felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the displacement of a stone no larger than a coin, the absence of the crickets chirping. He stood up smoothly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He walked past the sleeping guards, stepping over their outstretched legs without making a sound, and moved toward the edge of the ruined gate. He peered into the darkness. Figures were moving up the path. 10 of them. No, 12. They were not wearing the colors of Damir Khan or Mahmud. They wore ragged furs, mismatched armor, and carried heavy, curved blades. Akratai, border raiders, mercenaries who owed allegiance to no one but gold, men who survived in the lawless zones between the empires by butchering merchant caravans and kidnapping nobles for ransom. They had likely tracked the Byzantine escort, smelling the wealth of the royal prisoner they carried. Orhan Sahib drew his sword. The steel made a soft, deadly hiss. He could shout. He could wake the Byzantine guards, but the guards were slow, drunk on sour wine, and clumsy. The raiders would slaughter them in their sleep and take a sportia. He could not let that happen. Orhan Sahib stepped out from the ruined gate and walked directly into the center of the path, blocking the raiders' advance. The leader of the mercenaries, a massive brute with a face hidden behind a tangled iron helm, halted. He looked at the single Byzantine soldier standing in his way, and he laughed, a low, guttural sound. "Step aside, Roman," the raider growled in broken Greek. "We only want the woman. Give her to us and we will let you crawl away with your life." Orhan Sahib did not speak. He raised his blade, the tip pointing directly at the leader's throat. He settled into a low stance, his weight perfectly balanced, his breathing calm and rhythmic. He was not Clems in this moment. He was Orhan, the Ottoman spy, the shadow warrior trained by the greatest swordmasters of Bursa. The leader snarled and lunged forward, swinging his heavy curved blade in a massive, decapitating arc. Orhan Sahib did not block the strike. Blocking would break his wrist against the sheer weight of the blow. Instead, he stepped inside the arc. He moved with a speed that defied the human eye, slipping past the heavy blade. He drove his own sword upward, the steel sliding effortlessly through the gap under the raider's chin, piercing upward into the brain. The leader dropped dead before his heavy blade even hit the dirt. The remaining 11 raiders froze, shock paralyzing them for a fraction of a second. Then, enraged, they rushed him all at once. It was a symphony of violence. Orhan Sahib moved like water flowing through jagged rocks. He parried a thrust from his left, spun, and slashed the throat of the man behind him. He dropped to one knee, dodging a horizontal strike, and drove his blade into the femoral artery of a third raider. Blood sprayed across the mountain path, black in the moonlight. He rose, catching a fourth man's wrist, snapping the bone with a brutal twist of his armored gauntlet, and drove his pommel into the man's temple, shattering the skull. The sound of the clash finally woke the Byzantine guards. They stumbled to their feet, drawing their swords, their eyes wide with confusion and terror as they rushed to the ruined gate. But they did not join the fight. They stood frozen, staring in absolute awe. They watched as Clems, the quiet, unassuming soldier they had mocked for his caution, dismantled 11 hardened mercenaries with a lethal, terrifying perfection. He did not waste a single movement. Every step was calculated. Every strike was fatal. He was a machine of death, a whirlwind of steel and blood that left no room for survival. The last raider, realizing he was fighting a demon, dropped his weapon and turned to run back down the mountain path. Orhan Sahib did not let him run. He snatched a throwing knife from the belt of a fallen mercenary and hurled it in one fluid motion. The blade buried itself to the hilt between the fleeing man's shoulder blades. The raider collapsed, tumbling over the edge of the cliff and vanishing into the gorge below. Silence returned to the mountain. Orhan Sahib stood among the 12 bodies, his breathing slightly elevated, the blood dripping from his sword. He slowly turned to face the Byzantine guards. The guards took an involuntary step backward. The coarse man with the scarred cheek who had insulted him earlier was trembling, his sword drooping in his hand. They looked at Clems not as a fellow soldier, but as something monstrous, something entirely beyond their comprehension. "Clean this up," Arhan Sahib said, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion. "Throw the bodies into the gorge. We leave at first light." He did not wait for their response. He wiped his blade clean on the cloak of the dead leader, sheathed it, and walked back to his place against the wall. Asportia was sitting up. She had watched the entire battle. She had seen the Ottoman warrior beneath the Byzantine armor, the man she loved moving with the grace of a storm. When Arhan Sahib sat down, she looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of terror and profound, overwhelming reverence. He met her gaze, his chest rising and falling, and gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. "You are safe," the nod said. "I am here." After that, the sun began to rise, not over the mountains, but over the muddy, blood-soaked ground of Altadin Sahib's outpost, where the aftermath of treason was still being processed. Mustafa's body had been dragged away, thrown into an unmarked grave far from the camp, denied the prayers and the dignity reserved for loyal men. The silver coins he had taken from the Byzantine scout lay in the mud, ignored, a bitter reminder of the price of betrayal. Jarkata Sahib stood at the edge of the camp, washing his twin blades in a wooden bucket. The water turned pink, then dark red, swirling with the blood of the traitor. He wiped the steel meticulously with a cloth, inspecting the edges. His face was a mask of cold stone. He had done what needed to be done. He had avenged Boran, but as Evrenos had said, the vengeance did not close the wound. It only cauterized it, leaving a thick, unyielding scar. Barhan Faladios walked over to him. The commander moved slowly, his back stiff from the whip marks, but he stood tall, refusing to let the pain bend his spine. He looked at Jarkata Sahib and then at the clean blades. "You have lifted a heavy shadow from this camp, Jarkata," Barhan Faladios said, his voice grave and steady. "We were fighting with a knife pressed against our own throats, and we did not even know it. You saw what we could not see." Jarkata Sahib sheathed his blades, the steel sliding into the leather with a definitive click. "It was not a matter of seeing, Commander," Jarkata replied, his eyes looking out toward the distant hills. "It was a matter of knowing. I knew Boran's death was not a random ambush. The enemy is cruel, but they are not prescient. Only betrayal grants prophecy. I found the prophet, and I silenced him." Fatima approached them, walking alongside Evrenos. She carried a map tube under her arm, her armor strapped tightly, her expression fierce and determined. "The traitor is dead," she said, her voice cutting through the morning chill. "But the information he sold is already out there. Damir Khan's vanguard knows our positions. Yakid was only one hound unleashed by their masters. We must assume they are moving to exploit the gaps Mustafa gave them." Evrenos crossed his massive arms over his chest. "Then we do not give them gaps. We consolidate. We ride to join Al-Aliuddin Sahib's main force at the Valley Pass. If Damir Khan wants to exploit our flanks, he will find a wall of Ottoman steel waiting for him." Barhan Faladios nodded. He looked at Fatima, and a brief, unspoken communication passed between them, a recognition of the horrors they had survived in Yakid's cave, and the absolute refusal to let those horrors break them. "We ride within the hour," Barhan ordered. "Prepare the men. Leave the ghost of Mustafa in the mud. We fight for the living now." They turned to prepare the camp, the drums beginning to beat, the horses being saddled. The Ottoman war machine, wounded from within, was healing itself, hardening its ranks, preparing to face the storm that was sweeping across the land. And as the vanguard prepared to march, the strategic aftermath of the night's events reached the very heart of the empire. In the grand palace of Bursa, Sultan Arhan stood on the high balcony of his chambers, looking out over the city. The sun had fully risen, bathing the white stone of the mosques and the red tiles of the rooftops in a brilliant, golden light. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of baking bread and wood smoke from the markets below. It was a city alive, a city ignorant of how close it had come to total annihilation in the dark hours of the night. A messenger had ridden into the courtyard just before dawn. He carried no parchment. He carried only the verbal report from the coastal lookouts, relayed from the fastest riders along the shore. The Sultan had listened to the words, and for the first time in days, he had closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The bay burns, my Sultan. The sky is black with smoke. The Latin ships are ash on the water. Sultan Orhan placed his hands on the stone balustrade of the balcony. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He thought of Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga fighting through the inferno, commanding the ships that had broken the spine of the Pope's armada. He thought of Tarhan, riding through the mist, carrying the 5 words that made the victory possible. And he thought of Orhan Sahib, standing somewhere in the enemy's camp, surrounded by Byzantine guards, wearing a mask of deception while holding the fate of an empire in his hands. "We are not broken," the Sultan whispered to the wind. "The roots of this tree are deep. You cannot tear us from the earth so easily." A soft rustle of silk announced her presence. Nilufer walked onto the balcony, moving with a quiet, regal grace. She stood beside him, placing her hand gently over his. She did not ask for the news. She had seen the messenger arrive. She had seen the tension bleed from her husband's shoulders. She only looked at his profile, tracing the lines of exhaustion and the profound, enduring strength that defined him. "It is done," she asked softly. "The sea is ours, Nilufer," the Sultan replied, turning his hand to interlock his fingers with hers. "The armada is destroyed. The union of the churches has burned in the Bay of Megara." Nilufer closed her eyes, a silent prayer of gratitude washing over her. "And what of the spy?" she asked, her voice tight with the memory of her nightmare, the memory of Orhan standing with a sporcha. "What of Orhan Sahib?" Sultan Orhan's expression sobered. "He is still in the dark. He gave us the fire, but he is still walking among the ashes. We cannot pull him out yet. The war on land has only just begun. Andronikos will not surrender because his ships burned. He will lash out. He is a wounded beast now, and a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind." But as the Sultan spoke of the wounded beast, the reality of that wound was tearing through the walls of the Kanka. In his grand command chamber, Andronikos stood frozen, perfectly still, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the soot-covered messenger who had just fallen to his knees before the throne. The messenger's armor was scorched. His face was blistered. He had ridden 3 horses to death to reach the Kanka, carrying the news that defied all logic, all strategy, all divine right. "What are you saying?" Andronikos whispered, his voice trembling, a dangerous, razor-thin edge vibrating beneath the words. The messenger swallowed, a tear cutting through the black soot on his cheek. "The fleet, Jahanpanna, the Venetian and Genoese ships, they are gone." "Gone," Andronikos repeated, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. "What do you mean, gone? Did a storm take them? Did the sea swallow them?" "It was fire, Jahanpanna," the messenger wept. "The Ottoman galleys, they knew exactly where the fleet was anchoring. They sailed into the Bay of Megara before the Latins could even lower their sails. They unleashed the Greek fire. The entire bay, it is a graveyard. Not a single heavy galleon survived. The crusade, it is ashes." The silence that filled the command chamber was absolute, suffocating, as heavy as the stone walls themselves. Damir Khan stepped backward, his face draining of blood. Mahmud clutched the hilt of his sword, his jaw slack with disbelief. Zarkin's meticulous calculations, Killil's precise maps, the Pope's holy decree, all of it had been incinerated in a single night of Ottoman fury. Shahanshah, sitting in his chair in the corner of the room, slowly turned his head. The old, broken emperor looked at his grandson, and a dry, raspy laugh began to rattle in his chest. It was a terrible sound, the laughter of a man who had lost everything, mocking the man who had stolen it from him. "They burned it," Shahanshah wheezed, his laughter echoing in the hollow silence. "Your great alliance. Your divine crusade. They burned it before you could even draw your sword. I told you, Andronikos. You are playing with wolves and you believe you are the shepherd. Silence, Andronikos screamed, his voice cracking, his composure shattering entirely. He drew his sword and slashed it across the heavy wooden planning table, scattering the maps, the markers, the inkwells, everything crashing to the stone floor. Silence. He stood there, chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot, staring at the ruined maps. His mind raced, calculating, rewinding the events of the past 10 days, frantically searching for the flaw, the crack, the reason for this impossible catastrophe. They knew the rendezvous point. The thought hit him like a physical blow. The Ottomans had not guessed. They had not stumbled upon the Bay of Megara by chance. They had known. They had known exactly where to strike, exactly when the ships would be most vulnerable. But how? The location was a guarded secret. Only the highest commanders, the innermost circle, knew the coordinates. Damir Khan, Mahmud, Kuladze, the scribes. Andronikos slowly lifted his head. His eyes, burning with a paranoid, murderous realization, swept across the faces of his commanders. Damir Khan flinched. Mahmud looked away. "There is a rat in this room," Andronikos said, his voice dropping back into a terrifying, deadly whisper. "A rat feeding on my table, scurrying through my halls, whispering my words into the ears of Sultan Orhan." He walked slowly around the table, the tip of his sword dragging across the stone floor, making a horrible scraping sound. "Someone told them," he hissed. "Someone took the coordinates of the bay and passed them to the Ottoman dogs. Someone in this very fortress is a traitor." The paranoia that had always lived in the dark corners of Andronikos's mind now took total control. The union was broken. The ships were ash. The only thing left was the hunt for the spy. And as Andronikos ordered the guards to lock down the Kanka, as the interrogations were prepared and the torturers summoned, Orhan Sahib was riding down the mountain path, leading a sporcha and the terrified Byzantine guards toward the fortress. He did not know that the sea had burned. He did not know that his message had succeeded. He only knew that he was riding back into the belly of the beast, back to the mask, back to the lies. The strategic aftermath of the sea battle had rewritten the war. The Ottomans had secured their shores, but the land forces were now on a collision course, marching toward the great valleys where Damir Khan's vanguard and Alauddin Sahib's forces would meet in a storm of steel and blood. Jarkata Sahib rode with his avenging blades, Barhan Faladios rode with his scarred back, Fatima and Evrenos rode with their quiet, unbroken bond. And Sultan Orhan stood in Bursa, looking toward the horizon, knowing that the hardest days were still ahead. The game of shadows was ending. The time for open war, the time for the final, bloody reckoning between the empires had arrived. History is not written with ink. It is written with ash, with blood, with the prayers whispered in the dark and the oaths sworn in the light. The ships are gone, but the fire remains. The traitor is dead, but the spy walks the razor's edge. The baby sleeps, the queen prays, the avenger rides. The storm has broken the sea, but it has not yet broken the land. The war is not over. The war is moving, and destiny waits for them all at the edge of the blade, in the shadow of the minarets, under the cold, unblinking stars. Until the dawn breaks again, the march continues.
Is making changes. Orhan Sahib said, "Governors come and go, the city remains." The leader smiled again, but the smile did not reach his eyes. It never reached his eyes, because the eyes were doing something else entirely. The eyes were communicating. Orhan Sahib caught it, a flicker, a glance, the leader's gaze sliding to the left for half a heartbeat, touching one of the men near the wagons, and that man's hand moving, almost imperceptibly, toward the canvas covering the nearest crossbow. Orhan Sahib set down his cup. He looked at the leader and said, in a voice that had changed completely, that had dropped every pretense of warmth and weariness and become something that sounded like the hiss of a blade being drawn from its sheath, "How long has Andreas been paying you?" The leader's smile vanished, the camp froze, every man stopped moving, every hand went to a weapon, the air itself seemed to solidify as though the molecules between them had turned to iron. The leader said, I do not know what you are talking about. Orhan Sahib said, you know exactly what I am talking about. You have been sitting here for days, watching this road, waiting for someone. You were told what we look like. You were told which direction we would come from. You were told to make it look natural. A merchant caravan, harmless, inviting, and when we came close enough, when we were inside your circle, you would spring the trap. Crossbows first from the wagons, then swords, quick, efficient, total. He paused. The silence was absolute. Then he said, but you were not told who you would be facing. Andreas told you we were fugitives, refugees, easy prey. He did not tell you that you would be facing the Sultan of the K. He did not tell you that the man sitting across from you at this fire has broken sieges and shattered armies and walked through walls of steel and flame and come out the other side carrying the banner of Islam in his bloody hands. He did not tell you that, because if he had told you that, you would not be here. You would be somewhere far, far away from this road, thanking Allah that you had never been foolish enough to accept this contract. The leader's hand tightened on the handle of the dagger at his belt. His jaw worked, his mind calculated, and what it calculated was not favorable. He had 35 men, he had the numbers, but the man across from him had something that numbers cannot defeat: certainty. The absolute, unshakable, terrifying certainty of a man who has already accepted the possibility of his own death and has therefore become immune to the fear of it. And then from the ridgeline above there was a sound, a soft sound, the sound of a body hitting the ground, then another, then another. The sentries one by one were dropping. Shamal and his men had reached them. The eyes of the ambush were being blinded. The leader heard it. He looked up. He saw nothing, but he felt it. He felt the shift. He felt the balance of power tilting beneath his feet like a ship listing in a storm. Orhan Sahib said, your sentries are dead. Your ridgeline is ours. And behind those wagons, coming through the creek bed to the east, are 10 of my best fighters, each one of whom has killed more men than you have ever met. You are surrounded, you are outnumbered, and you are out of time. The leader looked at him. The calculation in his eyes changed. The mathematics of violence had reversed. Orhan Sahib said, you have two choices. Drop your weapons and tell me everything Andreas has planned. Or fight and die here on this road where no one will remember your name and no one will mourn your passing and no one will even bother to bury your bones. They will lie here until the dogs come, and the dogs will come. The leader's hand trembled on his dagger. He looked left, he looked right. He saw his men looking back at him, waiting for an order, waiting for a decision, waiting for leadership. And he saw in their eyes the same thing Orhan Sahib had seen, the dawning realization that they had been lied to, that they had been sent to kill a man who could not be killed, that they had been used as disposable instruments by a puppet master who would not shed a single tear when he learned of their destruction. The leader's hand released the dagger. He raised both hands. Malhan Khatan, the children, Aladdin, Ganya, and the newborn child, they are all in danger. The words hit Orhan Sahib like a cavalry charge. His stillness shattered. He turned to Evernoz and said, we ride now, no rest, no stops. We ride until the horses cannot carry us and then we run. Evernoz said, the horses are tired, Sultan. If we push them too hard, we will lose them before we reach Bursa. Orhan Sahib said, then we take their horses. He pointed at the prisoners' mounts tied near the wagons. Fresh horses, rested horses, horses that had been standing idle for days waiting for an ambush that had just failed spectacularly. Evernoz nodded. He began issuing orders. The prisoners were bound more securely and left under the guard of 3 soldiers who would follow at a slower pace. The fresh horses were saddled. Orhan Sahib mounted a tall, dark stallion that stamped and snorted beneath him as though it could sense the urgency in his body. Esporcha mounted behind him again. Fatima took a gray mare. Evernoz took a chestnut gelding. Tamir Boga took the largest horse in the string, a massive bay that looked like it had been bred for war rather than trade. And they rode. They rode like the wind rides, without restraint, without mercy, without thought for anything except the destination. The road blurred beneath them. The landscape streamed past like a painting being torn from its frame. The sun arced overhead and they did not notice. The wind struck their faces and they did not feel it. Their bodies moved with their horses in that ancient unconscious union between rider and mount that transforms 2 separate beings into a single instrument of speed and purpose. Orhan Sahib's mind raced faster than his horse. Zarkin. The name repeated itself in his thoughts like a drumbeat, steady, relentless, maddening. How long had it been going on? How much had been compromised? What secrets had been sold? What plans had been betrayed? What lives had been lost because information that should have remained sealed within the walls of the K Council had found its way into the hands of Andreas and through Andreas to the Shahzada, and through the Shahzada to every enemy that circled their borders like wolves circling a wounded deer. He thought of every battle that had gone wrong, every ambush they had failed to anticipate, every supply convoy that had been intercepted, Every secret mission that had been met with resistance in places where there should have been none. How many of those failures had been the result of Zarkin's treachery? How many of those defeats had been purchased with stolen intelligence? How many of those deaths had been authored not by the enemy's brilliance, but by the betrayal of a man who wore their uniform and prayed in their mosque and looked them in the eye and lied with every breath he took? The anger built inside him like water behind a dam, rising, swelling, pressing against the walls of his self-control with increasing force. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drive his sword into the earth and roar until the mountains trembled. He wanted to find Zarkin and look him in the face and ask the only question that mattered. Why did you do this? What did they offer you that was worth more than your honor? What price did they put upon your soul, and was it enough? Was it enough to buy your silence in the grave that awaits you? Was it enough to purchase the forgiveness of Allah, who sees every secret and hears every whisper and records every betrayal in a ledger that cannot be burned or buried or destroyed? But he did not scream, he did not roar, he rode, because that was what was needed. That was what his people needed, not his rage, his presence, not his fury, his leadership, not his vengeance, his justice. And justice, he reminded himself, is not the same as vengeance. Justice is measured, justice is deliberate, justice is the sword that cuts only what must be cut and spares what must be spared. Vengeance is the fire that burns everything, guilty and innocent alike, until nothing remains but ash and regret. He would not be a man of ash and regret, he would be a man of justice. They rode through the afternoon. The sun reached its zenith and began its long descent toward the western mountains. The shadows lengthened, the air cooled. The horses, pushed to their limits, began to slow, their sides heaving, their mouths foaming, their legs trembling with exhaustion. Orhan Sahib eased the pace but did not stop. He could not stop, not with the knowledge that burned inside him like a coal pressed against his heart. As the sun touched the mountains, as the sky turned from blue to gold to crimson to the deep luminous purple air, Tamir Boga and his 10 fighters moved east, dropping down into the dry creek bed one by one, their horses left behind, their weapons drawn, their bodies low and fast and utterly silent. Within minutes, the main column had reduced to just Orhan Sahib, Evernose, Fatima, Esporcha, Ayaz, and 3 additional soldiers. 8 people on horseback, riding toward a trap that contained 35 armed killers. They rode slowly now, deliberately. Orhan Sahib adjusted his posture, slouching slightly in the saddle, letting his sword hang loose at his hip, allowing his horse to amble rather than march. He looked to any observer like a tired traveler on a long road, a man thinking of nothing more dangerous than the meal that awaited him at his destination. Evernose followed his lead. He loosened his grip on his reins. He let his shoulders drop. He even hummed, a low, tuneless drone that sounded like a man trying to keep himself awake during a boring journey. But beneath that humming, beneath that relaxed facade, his muscles were coiled like springs and his eyes were counting the men on the ridgeline 2, 3, 4 sentries and the men among the wagons 20, 25, perhaps 30 in the camp itself, and the crossbows, at least 6 visible, hidden beneath canvas and grain sacks and piled blankets. They rounded the final bend and the crossroads came into view. The wagons were arranged in a loose semicircle near the river bank. A cooking fire burned in the center, sending a thin column of smoke into the sky. Men sat around the fire, eating, talking, laughing. They looked at first glance exactly like what they pretended to be, merchants resting during a long journey, harmless, unremarkable, forgettable. But Orhan Sahib saw what others would not. He saw that their laughter was too loud, performed for the benefit of anyone watching. He saw that their eating was theatrical, forks raised too high, mouths opening too wide, the pantomime of men who were focused not on their food but on the road. He saw that their positions around the fire were not random but tactical, each man angled to spring in a specific direction, each man within arm's reach of a weapon that was technically out of sight but practically available in less than a second. And he saw the leader, a man sitting slightly apart from the others on a low stool near the largest wagon, his back against the wheel, his legs stretched out before him, his hat pulled low over his eyes as though he were dozing. But beneath that hat Orhan Sahib knew were eyes that missed nothing. This was a man who had planned ambushes before. This was a man who understood patience. This was a man who knew that the most dangerous moment in any trap is not the springing of it but the waiting before. Orhan Sahib raised his hand in greeting as they approached. He called out in a voice that carried the perfect blend of weariness and friendliness. "Peace upon you, travelers. We have ridden long and our horses need water. May we share your fire?" The leader pushed his hat up. He looked at Orhan Sahib. He looked at Evernose. He looked at Fatima, who had pulled a scarf over her face in the manner of a modest traveler's wife. He looked at Esporcha. He counted 8 riders. He had 35 men. The mathematics of violence were clearly in his favor. He smiled and said, "Of course, brother. The road is long and the river is generous. Come rest, you are welcome." They dismounted, or rather Orhan Sahib, Evernose and Fatima dismounted. Esporcha remained on the horse, which Ayaz held by the bridle, positioned slightly back from the group near the edge of the road, angled toward the north. Escape position, ready to run. Orhan Sahib walked toward the fire. He walked casually, his hands visible, his sword swinging gently at his hip, his body language broadcasting harmlessness with the skill of a man who had survived 100 encounters exactly like this one. He sat down near the fire and accepted a wooden cup of water from one of the men and drank and said, "Thank you, brother. Where are you heading?" The leader said, "South to the markets at Iznik, grain and cloth, and you?" Orhan Sahib said, "North, to Bursa, family matters." The leader nodded. He said, "Bursa, beautiful city. I hear the new governor